Approaching one of the students, the hypnotist took his hand and concentrated. A few moments passed. A look of bewilderment appeared on his face. He left this student and took another by the hand. It was felt that he was all tense. Beads of sweat appeared on his forehead. But even here he was disappointed. He approached the third, and suddenly his face was distorted by a grimace of anger. His eyes jumped from one student to another, going over everyone on the stage. Finally, his gaze settled on the teacher. Everything happened so quickly that no one had time to restrain him. The hypnotist, with his face distorted with anger, jumped up to the teacher and unexpectedly slapped him in the face. The hall was numb and quiet. The psychic, however, quickly came to his senses, wiped the sweat from his forehead with a handkerchief and, smiling tightly, began to ask the teacher for forgiveness for a nervous breakdown, saying that he was tired, since his profession requires a lot of nervous tension. The telepathy experience was thwarted. Of course, he received forgiveness, but everyone's mood was completely ruined. The secret of the telepath's failure was explained very simply. As we learned from the teacher himself, he began mentally reciting the well-known prayer to the life-giving cross, "May God rise," used to protect against demonic influence. And when he also crossed the eyes of the psychic, he jumped up to him and struck back, but not spiritual, he could not, but only physical. Undoubtedly, prayer, the purpose of which is to attract the grace of the Holy Spirit to the one who is praying, had its effect with all evidence. The grace of God covered, or, as modern scientists would say, screened, not only the teacher himself, but also all the students who were with him on the stage. She even had an effect on the psychic. Thanks to this blessed screen, the SPMs were unable to telepathically transmit information about the numbers written on the sheets of paper to the mind of the hypnotist. Nevertheless, the psychic felt who was the source of the prayer and who was responsible for his failure. Returning to the experiments of V.L. Rakoff on stimulating creative activity in hypnosis, and guided by our conclusions, we will take the liberty of asserting that no work, musical, poetic, pictorial, of which the hypnotized person was in no way capable of in the usual state, is not the fruit of its potential capabilities, ostensibly unfolding in hypnosis. All this creative production belongs to the activities of creatures of the parallel world, which, in principle, can act without human mediation at all, as we saw in the case of Gustav Adolf Roll, or on the example of rock carvings in New Mexico. Finishing the topic of creativity under hypnosis. Let us pay attention to one very important conclusion that should be taken into account by all our readers. A person brought into contact with the SPM by a hypnotist remains connected to this world of unkind creatures that is not visible to the eye. This is the essence of the concept of hypnotizability, which makes it possible to control a person with the help of outside influence. Now SPM can use it, a person, for some of their purposes, and when they need it. In addition, the already established contact can be used by people who deliberately cooperate with the SPM for their own selfish purposes. We will talk about all this, as well as how to get rid of contact and the possibility of outside control of the human body and psyche, a little later. In conclusion, it should be noted that almost all artists who came into contact with the SPM, even if they were very talented by nature, by the end of their lives were morally degraded, went crazy or committed suicide. In order to be convinced of this, it is enough to study the biographies of Vrabel, Picasso, Dali, Soutine, Filonov, Van Gogh, Gauguin, Modigliani, and many other artists. We give brief information about only 3 of the artists named here. M. A. Vrabel, 1856 to 1910, in 1902 finished work on Demon Defeated, constantly saw in a dream the living face of his hero. In the same year a severe mental illness manifested itself in a sharp form, went mad. Van Gogh, 1853 to 1890, spends the last 2 years of his life in psychiatric hospitals in Hulls, cuts off his ear in Saint Remy, and in Auvers-sur-Oise, where he commits suicide. A. Modigliani, 1884 to 1920, was influenced by African cult sculpture, committed suicide. Illusionistic form of self-realization SPM. The great deception is not sleight of hand. In order to understand in what cases and how intelligent beings of the parallel world self-actualize and manifest themselves in the art of illusionism, it is necessary, first of all, to remember their capabilities. In this case, we will be interested in their ability to influence the mental, from Latin mens, mind, and sensory perceptual, sensory perceiving, sphere of a person, since it is these spheres that are involved in the audience, who came to the performance of the illusionist. Naturally, we will have to exclude from consideration all tricks and manipulations in which special optical devices, instruments, and apparatus are used, as well as ordinary manual dexterity. So, first of all, we should remember about the ability of SPM to influence directly on human consciousness. Thus, we will be interested, in this case, in the so-called telepathic capabilities of the SPM, thanks to which, most often, it becomes possible for the creatures of the parallel world to contact humans, as well as sensory energy methods of influencing the higher regulatory systems of the human brain. Telepathic mechanisms. Numerous descriptions of contacts, collected by us from various sources, make it possible to distinguish two main forms of the telepathic effect of SPM on a person, mental and sensory. Moreover, each of these forms can be designed both for an individual, for one person, and for a group reception of telepathic suggestion. In addition, both forms of human exposure to SPM are often used in combination. The mental, suggestive telepathic, form of SPM impact on a person is characterized by a direct impact exclusively on the spiritual structure of a person, that is, his consciousness and memory. Moreover, the impact that affects primarily intrapsychic processes. In this case, SPMs telepathically introduce mental, sound, speech, musical, or visual information into a person's consciousness, which can be transformed by his consciousness into abstract symbolic, usually false, products necessary for mental activity, often pathological. This form of influence leads, as a rule, to autopsychic alienation of feelings, thoughts, and consciousness of one's own personality, and in some cases it is expressed as allopsychic alienation of perceptions, representations from the outside world, in the terminology of Gag. The sensory energy, form of influence of the SPM is directed almost exclusively to the sensory perceptual, sensory perceiving, sphere of a person. It is characterized by the energetic effect of SPM on specific parts of the cerebral cortex, gustatory, tactile, and olfactory analyzers, i.e., on the material structure of a person, which creates a false impression of irritation of the receptor fields of a particular part of the body or its organ. Due to this effect, a person experiences false sensations, for example, various forms of synestopathy, tactile hallucinations, as well as autometamorphopsia, hallucinatory perception of the shape and size of one's own body, paragusia, gustatory hallucinations, alatriosmia, olfactory illusions and hallucinations, and others. Their appearance is due to the fact that the weak electrical discharges received by the brain from SPM, which are absolutely identical to the impulses received from the corresponding receptors of the body, are completely indistinguishable from each other for brain analyzers. It is quite obvious that the sensations of a person arising as a result of the specified impact of the SPM, on the one hand, and the sensations arising from any mechanical, chemical, or other objective effect on the receptors of his body, on the other hand, will also be absolutely indistinguishable from each other. Thus, receiving false sensory information from the SPM through the analyzers of its own brain, a person's consciousness will feel quite realistically what does not exist and cannot be. It is this mechanism, in our opinion, that underlies almost all deceptions of feelings described and studied by psychopathology. We also include certain phenomena of mental automatism, in particular, motor volitional automatism, G. Clairambelt, 1930, as well as various distortions of the sense of time and space to this form of the impact of SPM on a person. Let us briefly note here that the phenomena of motor volitional automatism are explained by the sensory energetic influence of the creatures of the parallel world on the motor cortex of the brain. A similar effect can be simulated using weak electrical discharges directed to the corresponding parts of the motor cortex, thereby artificially causing, for example, involuntary movements of the subject's hands. Since the 1930s, similar experiments have been carried out in many closed clinics under the supervision of military doctors. Looking ahead, we note that in many cases, involuntary movements, tonic or clonic convulsions, bite of the tongue, urination, etc., accompanying epileptic seizures, according to our observations, are of the same nature. They are the result of the sensory energy impact of SPM on a group of neurons in the sensory area of the cortex, called an epileptic focus, which is detected on electroencephalograms, EEG, by the presence of local epileptic activity in the corresponding leads. In conclusion, we will try, on the basis of our observations, to offer an explanation of the cause of the appearance of hallucinations, since such an explanation is still absent in all scientific works concerning this problem. So, the emergence of hallucinations outside the clouding of consciousness, pseudo and true hallucinations, hallucinosis, and hallucinoids, as well as all hallucinatory phenomena observed in states of clouded consciousness, is due to the special effect of beings of the parallel world, SPM, on consciousness or the central nervous system, CNS, of a person. Various states of darkened consciousness, with the exception of those that have an objective cause, poisoning, trauma, etc., indicate only a higher degree of the impact of SPM on a person, his consciousness and the central nervous system, due to the deviation of the blessed divine energies from him to a greater extent. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. After a brief description of the methods of influence of SPM on consciousness and emotions, as well as ways of distorting the sensations and perceptions of a person, we will move on to consider specific facts that will help us find out the essence of the most complex and stunning tricks of magicians illusionists. In the early 1980s, the journal Science and Religion, which was still quite atheistic at that time, now it has become completely occult, published an article about how Indian fakirs deceive the public. We did not remember the meaning of the author's absurd judgments as unnecessary, but the description of the performance itself was well imprinted in our memory. It was about the performance in England of the famous Indian illusionist fakir. The audience filled all the stands of the sports stadium. Finally, a swarthy fakir in a turban came out onto the field with an assistant boy. They also brought out a bay of a thick ship's rope and a large wicker basket with a lid. The fakir sat down next to the basket in the lotus position and plunged into meditation. The boy stood next to him. Several seconds passed, and suddenly the whole stadium, holding its breath, saw the end of the rope tremble and slowly begin to rise, like the head of a cobra coiled into a ring. The rope continued to climb by itself higher and higher, unwinding the bay ring by ring. At a height of 5 meters, he finally froze motionless. The boy walked over to the vertically stretched rope and tried to swing it, pushing it with both hands. The rope stood motionless, like a steel pipe dug into the ground. A further description of a similar presentation will be cited from the magazine UFO, No. 44 of November 1st, 1999, p. 19. The boy assistant climbs up the hardened rope and disappears. In a fit of anger, the fakir grabs a knife, throws himself along a solid rope in pursuit of the boy and also disappears. After a while, bloody parts of the human body begin to fall from the air to the ground. Then the newly appeared fakir descends and puts the parts of the body in a box. A moment, and from there a whole and unharmed boy jumps out. The faint-hearted English ladies, as I recall, fainted, seeing children's hands and feet flying from somewhere above, but the male half wasted no time at that time. The compatriots of the legendary Sherlock Holmes quietly installed 4 cameras from different sides of the stadium in advance and safely filmed the entire performance from start to finish. Imagine the amazement of the British when, after looking at 4 films, they saw that during the entire time the performance lasted, the fakir remained sitting in the same position next to the motionless bay, and next to him, sighing and shifting from his foot on his leg, standing, bored, the boy assistant. Thus, it turned out that everything seen by the audience during the performance did not actually happen at all. How, then, could thousands of spectators observe what was not in reality and, conversely, not see the real fact that the fakir and the boy remained motionless on the field of the stadium right in front of their eyes? Our studies of this phenomenon allow us to conclude that the visual image of a pre-directed clip was introduced telepathically directly into the minds of people who came to the show, bypassing the usual way of receiving visual information through the eyes and optic nerves. Thousands of enthusiastic spectators saw the extraordinary and terrible sight only in their own minds thanks to the direct telepathic broadcast. Now we have to solve the question, who could broadcast a false visual image, completely indistinguishable from the real one, into the minds of thousands of spectators who came to the stadium? The journal article mentioned above cites the opinion of two American researchers, Richard Wiseman and Peter Lamont, published in Nature, who believe that Indian fakirs have the ability to instill visual illusions on a large number of people at the same time. We cannot agree with this point of view for the reason that our long-term observations unequivocally indicate the impossibility for a person to possess any supernatural abilities, except for those possessed by all representatives of the species Homo sapiens, and therefore called natural. Although quantitatively and qualitatively they can vary quite significantly. Whose abilities are they? Everything supernatural for people is, however, quite natural for beings of the parallel world, SPM. This opinion is confirmed by all researchers who have studied the possibility of the impact of UFOs and humanoids on people and material nature. Above, we have already said that all the methods of acquiring paranormal abilities, known in Hinduism, Buddhism, Lamaism, as well as in occultism of any type, are reduced to establishing a connection with beings of a parallel world, SPM, on what, by the way? The latter constantly insist in their telepathic messages, spread not only by the ancients, but also by all modern contactees. Thus, it should be recognized that all religious cults of the Hindu group, without exception, for many centuries have been doing exactly what? Opening oneself with the help of special psychophysical exercises, destroying the natural beneficial protection, for the entry of cosmic energies, or rather, SPM, into their body, a yogi, fakir, magician, or occultist get, but not for nothing. The opportunity to use their abilities for the most diverse goals, illusionism, para-healing, suppression of the will of people in order to control them, witchcraft and others. In the same way, all conversations about receiving cosmic consciousness, about its expansion and enlightenment with the help of meditations and other yogic and occult practices that excite the imagination of the profane, mean nothing more than connecting to contact with entities that receive the ability to manipulate the consciousness of a person who is now in their power. At the same time, all that false visual, sound, and sensory information, which SPM is introduced into a person's consciousness by telepathic or sensory energy method, enthusiastic adherents of these cults take for revelation, expansion, and enlightenment. In fact, all this misinformation, this is the opinion of the ufologists themselves, only leads them to a clouding of consciousness and a departure from the truth. The SPM intends to use some of its promising contactees to propagate their teachings to the general public. Thus, they give a sense of euphoric states, show an intra-projection, i.e., in front of the inner gaze, exciting journeys to other worlds or subtle planes of being, the so-called exits to the astral plane, give amazing revelations, almost always false, as well as show through them, i.e. through contactees, their paranormal abilities. It is precisely these natural abilities for the creatures of the parallel world that the ability to influence the physical world and the psychic nature of man is that spiritually illiterate people take for supernatural abilities, supposedly available in an undisclosed, latent, state in all people. Returning to the question of the method of introducing false visual information into the consciousness of thousands of viewers while simultaneously disabling, suppressing, their ability to naturally receive visual impulses from the retina to the visual cortex, and from it into consciousness. We should now express our point of view based on own observations. We believe that such a massive impact on the consciousness of such large masses of people is available only to creatures with capabilities that significantly exceed the capabilities of any person. It is precisely such creatures, both now and in all previous centuries, were the inhabitants of the ultra-thin parallel world, which we call SPM. Thus, we come to the conclusion that the illusionist trick in the stadium, striking the idle curiosity of the crowd to empty effects. Another interesting case for our study was recorded by Dr. A.P. Timofeyev in 1922, according to a former naval officer, who by that time was already an archimandrite and asceticist in the Kiev-Pechersk Lavra, then not yet closed by the Bolsheviks. Hatred of the fakir. Having become a priest, this brilliant naval officer, the commander of a battleship, and now, Fr. Nikolai Drobyazhin, fluent in several European languages, was appointed a missionary and served in the churches of various Russian embassies, China, Tibet, and India. The events that he described took place back in the 19th century, at a time when the former sailor was heading to India, to the place of his new ministry. The ship Louise, on which the Russian missionary was sailing, was approaching the island of Ceylon. In Colombo, he had to stock up on coal, and the passengers had ample time to disembark. The English colonial Colonel Elliot, who knew the city and its surroundings well, suggested, "Ladies and gentlemen, would you like to travel a few miles out of town and visit one of the local fakir sorcerers? Maybe we'll see something interesting." It was already evening when a small group of 8 people, to which Fr. Nikolai, drove along a magnificent road in the jungle. Finally they found themselves in a large clearing, where a fakir's hut stood under a huge tree. Near the fire sat a skinny old man in a turban and, crossing his legs, gazed motionlessly into the fire. The colonel spoke to the assistant boy, and he brought stools, on which the travelers sat. The darkness of the night was a little dispersed only by the young moon. "Look! Look there, at the tree!" exclaimed Miss Mary in an agitated whisper. The entire surface of the immense crown of the tree under which the fakir was sitting seemed to slowly float in the soft moonlight, and the tree itself began to melt little by little, and its contours blurred. Soon, before our shocked gaze, the surface of the sea with rolling waves opened with extraordinary clarity, but then a white steamer appeared in the distance. Dark smoke poured from its 2 large pipes. It quickly approached us, cutting through the waves. A whisper swept through our ranks when we read the name of our ship, laid out in golden letters, on its stern, Louise. But what struck us the most was that we saw ourselves on the ship. Do not forget that at the time this was happening, none of us had heard of cinema, and it was impossible even to imagine anything like that. But what was especially striking, I saw not only myself, but at the same time the entire deck of the ship, down to the smallest details. As if from a bird's eye view, why it simply could not be in reality. I completely forgot that I am a priest and a monk, that it hardly befits me to take part in such spectacles. The glamour was so overwhelming that both heart and mind were silent. But suddenly my heart was beating anxiously and painfully. My whole being was seized by fear. My lips moved by themselves and began to utter the words, "Lord, Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner." I felt immediate relief. It seemed that some invisible chains, which were entangled in me, were beginning to fall off me. The prayer became more focused, and my peace of mind returned with it. I continued to look at the tree, when suddenly, as if caught by the wind, the picture became foggy and dispersed. I saw nothing else, except for a huge tree, illuminated by the light of the moon, and a fakir sitting under the tree, while my companions continued to talk about their impressions, peering into a picture that did not disappear for them. But it was as if something began to happen to the fakir himself. He fell on his side. The alarmed youth ran up to him. The session was unexpectedly interrupted. As I left, I involuntarily turned around for the last time to capture the whole scene in my memory, and suddenly I shuddered from an unpleasant sensation. My gaze met the gaze of the fakir, full of hatred. This gaze once and for all opened my eyes to the one whose power actually produced this miracle. A.P. Timothy Book, God's People. M. Pilgrim, 1995, pp. 57-61. Dr. Faust's jokes. Earlier examples of telepathic transmission of false visual information in the practice of the famous German magician of the 16th century, Dr. Johann Faust, we find in the descriptions of his contemporaries, Augustine Lerheimer and Philip Cambrius. Once Faust drank in the same tavern with his drinking companions, and at each toast they drained the mug halfway, or even to the bottom, as is the custom among the Saxons and all other Germans. And it happened here that the attendant boy poured so much wine either into the mug or into the goblet of Faust that it overflowed. Faust scolded him and promised to devour him, if he did it again at least once. The boy laughed, "So you can eat me up," and once again poured him over the edge. Then Faustus opened his mouth wide and swallowed him. Then he grabbed a tub of water and with the words, "Good food must be washed down well," he knocked it down his throat. The owner began to persuade him to return the boy to him, threatening to deal with the guest otherwise. Faust told him not to worry and to look behind the stove. The boy ended up there. There was no dry thread on him, and he was shaking all over with fear. And the devil shoved him there, having managed to first turn out a tub of water on him. The same devil so averted the eyes of everyone who was in the tavern that they imagined that Dr. Faust ate the guy and swallowed a tub of water. Augustin Lerkheimer von Steinfelden. Christic Bedenken und Erinnerung von Zauberei. 1585. Once, when Faust was spending time with his acquaintances who had heard about his sorcery, they asked him to show them at least some example of his magic, ripe grapes, believing that since now is the wrong time of the year, and it was winter in the yard, he cannot do it by any means. Faust agreed and promised to immediately deliver what was required to the table, warning them to remain completely silent and not think to stir until he ordered them to pick the berries, otherwise they would be in mortal danger. After everyone agreed, he, with the help of his charms, so clouded the eyes and feelings of the drunken company that they dreamed of a magnificent grape bush, on which hung clusters of juicy grapes of extraordinary sizes, and there were as many bunches of these as there were gathered. Spurred on by curiosity and thirsty, the drunks took up their knives, eagerly awaiting the order to cut the grapes. Having held them long enough in such an empty seduction, Faust finally removed the spell. The bush with grapes dissolved in smoke, and the gullible friends saw that, reaching for the bunch, each of them grabbed his own nose and already swung his knife, so if only someone, contrary to the agreement, began to unauthorized cut off the grapes, then he would cut his own nose, operi horrorum subsisiverum. Frankhoff, 1602, s. 314. When the omnipotent aliens are powerless. The creatures of the parallel world used similar methods of influencing human consciousness in all these three cases, and in the case that Fr. Nikolai Drobiazhin, both in the case of the fakir at the English Stadium, and in the magical experiments of Dr. Faust. However, it should be noted that, unlike Johann Faust and the fakir, who spoke in England, the Ceylon sorcerer fakir, more precisely, his SPM curator, inspired visual information, not having the goal of giving a complete illusion of the action taking place at the moment. The last option is interesting in that the visual information was regenerated, as it were, from the memory of one of the creatures of the parallel world and was immediately transmitted directly into the minds of the audience. This video sequence contained information about what had already happened before, and the image was given from an unusual point of perception, from a bird's eye view, from where none of the travelers could see the ship under any condition. There is no doubt that the creature that was watching the ship from this very position was itself broadcasting from its memory the image seen several hours ago. It is also significant that the fakir himself could not broadcast such an image even presumably, since he stayed in his clearing constantly and could not see the ship. Another striking aspect of the described Fr. Nicholas events, the impact of prayer. Non-church people, hearing about such cases, are often perplexed. How can words possess such an effective power, even if they are addressed to a God incomprehensible to them? But we see that not the words themselves, but divine grace, which is the Creator's answer to the prayer of the priest, barred him from outside influence, creating around the priest, in modern terms, like a protective screen that prevents the telepathic transmission of the image into his consciousness. Thanks to the grace-filled help of God through prayer, Fr. Nicholas, he stopped seeing this extraordinary and fascinating sight, although the rest of the travelers continued to observe him. The reason for the appearance of such protection of consciousness is that according to the word of St. Seraphim of Sarav, prayer is the most important way to acquire the grace of the Holy Spirit, which, being an uncreated divine energy, protects a person from negative outside influences. I would like to especially emphasize that the uncreated divine energy has nothing to do with those energies that are used today in occultism, although all kinds of sorcerers and learned psychics often assure us of the divinity of the power shown by them. More on this later. Here we just note that both the inspirers of all kinds of paranormal phenomena, SPM, and their weapons, various occultists always and everywhere use lies, using the tried and tested method of substitution, the essence of which will be disclosed below. That fact, that the power of suggestion of a very skillful fakir, today it would certainly be called divine, has dried up under the influence of the priest's prayer, speaks for itself. It is quite obvious that there can be no question of any divinity of this power. As we can see, the grace of God attracted by the prayer of the priest had a protective effect not only on Fr. Nicholas, but also at all those present, preventing the SPM from continuing to broadcast the image into the minds of the audience. Moreover, the fakir himself, falling on his side, almost collapsed into the fire. But also on all those present, preventing the SPM from continuing to broadcast the image into the minds of the audience. Moreover, the fakir himself, falling on his side, almost collapsed into the fire. But also on all those present, preventing the SPM from continuing to broadcast the image into the minds of the audience. Moreover, the fakir himself, falling on his side, almost collapsed into the fire. Using this example, we are again convinced that the almost omnipotent SPM are powerless in their miracles, which easily deceive the inhabitants, and sometimes harm them, if a person applies prayer, as we have already seen in the story with the monks and those who visited them. Vengeful aliens or during a hypnosis session on the stage of a student theater. What is sensation implantation? For those who still continue to doubt the participation of the beings of the parallel world, SPM, in all the most significant and unusual representations of illusionists, who are in fact real mediums who consciously contact with these creatures, here is the statement of the greatest magician, illusionist and medium from Israel, Uri Geller. In their research, the Americans N. Woodrow N.A. Brooks, Faith and Life, No. 5, 1991, cite his own words that he receives supernatural power for his miracles from 9 aliens from the planet Hoof. 9 assures that they have solved all the problems of being. They came to teach the inhabitants of the earth a new science, including telekinesis, control over matter, implantation of sensations and knowledge into the minds of other people. Citation from the book, The Religion of Antichrist. Publishing House, Staff, Novosibirsk, 1997, p. 60. Special attention should be paid to the words about control over matter. Here we mean the ability of SPM to change the properties of matter, as well as about the implantation, i.e. introduction, of sensations and various information into the consciousness of people, which, as we have already seen, SPM is widely used to the detriment of people. We have already talked about how the contactee from Vologda L. Kaisleva and many others received telepathically new, unknown information to her. But perhaps the meaning of the term, sensation implantation, is not entirely clear to the reader. In order to make it more understandable, let us recall the consequences of contact with the SPM of one of the residents of the town of Alexandrov, Vladimir region, which was described at the beginning of the book. He felt the presence of someone else's will. Unbearable outside influences day and night, constantly. Vibrations, buzzing in the head of different tonality and frequency, crawling through the body of invisible beings, and sometimes such a burning sensation inside that, according to him, death at such moments seemed like deliverance. These are vibrations that are falsely felt in the body, crawling through the body, sometimes under the skin, of incomprehensible creatures, burning inside and similar phenomena. These painful sensations are not actually a response of the organs of perception and analyzers of the brain to real external and internal stimuli. They are caused by the sensory energy, impulse, effect of SPM on certain parts of the cerebral cortex, where tactile signals from the surface of the body and its internal organs should be projected, which provokes false perception. It is this kind of introduction of phantom, but often very painful sensations that the creatures of the parallel world, through their medium contactee Uri Geller, called the implantation of sensations. But before proceeding to the analysis of the ways of self-realization of the creatures of the parallel world in the so-called original genre through our Israeli contactee Uri Geller, let's say a few words about himself. W. Geller was born in Tel Aviv in 1946. After demobilization in 1967 from the Israeli army, in 1968 to 1969, worked as a photo model in an advertising agency, and in 1969 began performing on stage. In 1972 he moved to Europe, where his performances were very successful. At the invitation of renowned astronaut Dr. Edgar D. Mitchell, Apollo 14, and Dr. A. Puharik, Uri Geller moves to the United States in the same year. At the international level, Uri has successfully demonstrated his telepathic skills to the heads of the United States and Soviet Union delegations to the nuclear arms talks in Geneva, Internet. His mediumistic abilities manifested themselves in early childhood. Uri first surprised his parents when he was 4 years old. One day, his mother came home from a party where friends were having fun playing cards. Little Uri unexpectedly told her the exact amount of money she had lost. But really amazing things started to happen when Uri was 6 years old. Once his father gave him a wristwatch. In a lesson at school, the boy noticed that the clock suddenly began to rush for half an hour. There was nothing strange about this. Yuri turned the hands back half an hour, but the clock began to rush again. When this was repeated several times, he decided that the watch was faulty. After his return home, the clock began to run normally again, but then the hands bent upward, and the mechanism was completely out of order. And then the phenomena associated with the deformation of objects began. At dinner one day, the handle of his spoon broke off without any influence from Yuri. But that did not end there. In one of the cafes, which mother and son often visited, spoons began to bend, although Yuri never touched them. Uri Geller owes the rise of his career to the American scientist Andrea Puharich. He met with Geller at one of the discos. He sat in the hall with the audience and watched the events on the stage. It was Geller's usual telepathy session. The next day, on the initiative of Puharich, their meeting took place. Geller took a piece of paper and wrote a number on it, and then asked Puharich to think of 3 numbers. After that, Yuri showed him his note with numbers. To Puharich's amazement, the numbers matched. Then Geller forced the thermometer to rise a few degrees, set the deliberately stopped clock in motion and broke the wedding ring. Puharich became convinced that Geller's gift is something unique. In late 1973, Geller was invited to take part in a BBC television program specifically dedicated to Yuri's phenomenal abilities. Famous scientists were invited. During the meeting, the presenter of the program said that the studio began to receive numerous calls from people amazed at the deformation of their own cutlery and the resumption of the wrist and wall clocks. The English scientist, mathematician from Cambridge Ted Buston, was most struck by the disappearance from the table plastic box with a set of screwdrivers and the appearance of the same box in the next room, and all the screwdrivers were broken. Microscopic examination showed that the break was not made by a human hand, but appeared as a result of intense heating. This is followed by an excerpt from Uri Geller's diary, which describes an incident that astonished him himself, which happened to him while walking around the city. Suddenly I felt that I was being irresistibly pulled upward. I stopped feeling the weight of my body. Closing my eyes in surprise, I almost immediately opened it again and found that I was in the air and flying, rapidly approaching the windows of some veranda, one of which was covered with a mosquito net. Breaking through the net, I flew into the room and crashed on a round table made of thick glass. He turned over, and I landed on the floor of the veranda. From V. Yashin's article, This Mysterious Uri Geller, Interreklama, Internet. All the phenomena described in V. Yashin's article associated with the name of W. Geller, leading scientists all over the world into complete bewilderment, have been used since ancient times by magicians, fakirs, illusionists, or artists of the original genre, call them whatever you like, in their performances, which throughout human history. They were arranged everywhere, in the palaces of the pharaohs and in the royal castles, on the stage and in the arenas of circuses, in stadiums and discos, in beer bars or right on the dirty streets of Indian cities. We will name only those of the phenomena that we find in this article, dedicated to the famous psychic, magician, and illusionist medium, highlighting several categories of these phenomena. 1. 2 facts, guessing the amount of money lost by the mother, as well as the 3-digit figure that A. Puharich was supposed to write, seems to be talking about a parapsychological phenomenon called telepathy. 2. Other facts, deceleration of the clock, as well as the start of a stopped clock, as if spontaneous deformation and breakage of objects, our hands, cutlery, and screwdrivers, raising a column of liquid in a thermometer, etc. Talk about some kind of contactless influence on objects of the material world. This effect is conventionally called psychokinesis. Particular attention should be paid here to the deformation of objects and the start of clocks in the homes of radio listeners during an interview with W. Geller on the BBC, as well as the results of microscopic examination of the location of the screwdriver fracture. 3. The fact of the unexpected and unnoticed by the researcher, Dr. Ted Buston, the movement of the box with screwdrivers from one room to another should be attributed, apparently, to the phenomenon of teleportation. 4. The involuntary flight of a frightened medium, Uri Geller, from the street through a mesh-covered window onto the veranda of someone else's house seems to fit into the concept of levitation. For over 100 years, continues V. Yashin, scientists from all over the world have been inviting psychics and mediums to their laboratories to demonstrate their abilities and test them using scientific methodology. So far, the results of such studies are more disappointing than hopeful. The fact is that one of the fundamental principles of a scientific experiment is the possibility of its repetition, i.e. reproducibility. And this, for unknown reasons, is not always possible. Where do these forces and energies come from? What is behind them? A huge variety of questions can be posed, but modern science does not yet give clear and precise answers to this, and therefore it is necessary to build all kinds of guesses and hypotheses, based on the statements of philosophers and psychologists, as well as on many years of experience in studying such phenomena. Ibid. p. 4-5. In the meantime, scientists are building false, and therefore, all kinds of guesses and hypotheses. We will try to give one and, moreover, a single explanation of the very multidimensional phenomenon of parapsychological phenomena. Resolving all these questions from the standpoint of the new, but in fact, the well-forgotten old paradigm, which contains the concept of active influence both on the material world and on the human psyche of rational beings of the parallel world, belonging to a different, non-protein nucleic form of being of rational beings. True conductors of miracles. At the very beginning of our research, we showed that many scientists who can in no way be blamed for clericalism, thanks to the study of the space around us, see the experiments of V.G. Azaji, Luciano Baccone, academician Kaznachev, etc. As well as a result of many years' studies of anomalous phenomena and UFOs, academic V. Vanek, Prof. M. Varlamov, Jacques Vallée, Brad Stager, J. Kill and others, came to the conclusion about the existence of an ultra-thin parallel world. He, in essence, is a different, non-material form of being of intelligent beings, whose abilities significantly exceed any capabilities of any of the representatives of the well-known species of Homo sapiens. Radiation, radioactive, thermal, electromagnetic, anti-gravitational, chronal, geo, and biochemical, as well as psychophysical influences that have on technology. People and the nature of the parallel world around us and those bizarre formations that we commonly call UFOs are now known all over the world in such quantity that almost no one doubts their reality. These effects, radiation, heat, electromagnetic, etc., are the cause of all the various phenomena noted both during the observation of UFOs and during close contacts with humanoids, as well as in cases of the manifestation of a phenomenon called poltergeist. So, for example, the following phenomena can be caused by various influences of creatures of a parallel world. The disappearance of the current in power lines and in the electrical systems of aircraft and cars. Disappearance of information from magnetic media and from memory blocks of computers. The appearance of images on unused and packed photographic films. Changing the speed of the clock in one direction or the other. Setting fire to aircrafts and houses with the help of powerful heat radiation. Spontaneous appearance of messages or drawings on the walls or on sheets of paper, and sometimes on the screens of computers or radar stations, radars. Lifting into the air and moving objects and people in it without any visible physical impact. Teleportation of various objects and people over long distances. Breakage of various equipment, furniture, and other items. Changes in the chemical composition of some substances. Oppression or, conversely, activation of plant growth. Phosphorescence, afterglow of crystalline soil particles as a result of excitation of their crystal lattices by ultraviolet, microwave and, possibly, X-ray radiation. Exposure of people to a lethal dose of radiation, leading to death. Irradiation of the contactee with light waves of the invisible spectrum, causing a retinal burn, resulting in loss or, at best, a sharp deterioration in vision. The disappearance of people without a trace. The appearance on the human body, and even on his insides, of burns caused by some kind of strong heat radiation. The emergence, as a result of contact with a UFO or with SPM, in some people the ability to transmit and reproduce. A. Creative ideas that SPM want to realize in the material world through a contactee, medium. B. New religious or political concepts that SPM want to introduce into the public consciousness. The occurrence of various mental illnesses is a result of contact in many of the contactees. The appearance of memory pathology, as a result of contact, in the form of complete or partial, amnesia, loss of memory either for a certain period of time, or for some facts, as well as hypermnesia, pathologically increased ability to remember. Telepathic communication of humanoids, SPM, with each other, as well as with the contactee. In the latter case, the contact, as a rule, is one way in the form of suggestion of any information from the SPM. The reader has probably already drawn attention to the fact that magicians, illusionists, fakirs, mediums, and psychics do absolutely nothing new that would go beyond the just described capabilities of the creatures of the parallel world, SPM, when they influence people. Products of human activity and nature. Considering all of the above, as well as the direct relationship shown above many times between the appearance of any paranormal abilities in a person, on the one hand, and his contact with SPM, on the other, we are forced to state that all the effects of telepathy, telekinesis, teleportation, psychokinesis, for example, deformation of objects, stopping the clock, etc., levitation, walking on hot coals, and other physical, psychophysical, and biophysical phenomena are performed either directly by beings of a parallel world, constantly in contact with some of the people, magicians, mediums, etc., or through these intermediaries themselves, acting on the suggestion of the SPM or under their direct influence. This is the explanation and reason for all the parapsychological phenomena known to mankind since ancient times, since during the entire life of people on Earth there was no such period when they would be free from the influence of the creatures of a parallel world. Once again, we remind the readers of the speech of academician of the Russian Academy of Medical Sciences VP Kaznacheva at the 8th International Scientific Conference, Ufological Factor in Man, in October 1999. Molecular biological objects, the academician asserts, are influenced by an extramolecular component, possibly of extraterrestrial origin and having a negative psi field. The poison of extraneous biopsychic energy fills the space around a person more and more. UFO Magazine, No. 48, 1999, p. 7. In the role of radios. Now we have finally found out that the extramolecular component, which has such a negative effect on molecular biological objects, i.e., us, people, are intelligent personalities of a parallel world that exists outside of our space and time. Armed with such an understanding of the essence of the problem we are studying, now knowing where these forces and energies come from, what, or rather, who, is behind them, v. Yashin, we will be able to further consider in more detail the 4 categories of phenomena of the famous Uri Geller, showing that they are all the result of the contact that Geller had on the initiative of SPM in infancy. Based on the story of U. Geller himself about childhood in his book My Story, it is possible to establish the moment of the beginning of active contact of the extramolecular component, i.e. SPM, with a 3-year-old boy, and note that this contact began similar to a ray, or rather a certain extramolecular entity, into the body of the founder of the Reiki teaching, Mikao Yuzui, on Mount Fujiyama, see above. Here is how about a similar entry, and with the same unpleasant sensations in the so-called third eye, as in the Japanese contactee, Uri Geller himself reports. The day was leaning towards evening, but it was still light enough. All alone, I was playing in an Arab garden not far from my home in Tel Aviv. And suddenly an incredibly piercing ringing rang out in my ears, drowning out all other sounds. The condition was very strange. Time seemed to stand still, and even the trees seemed to stop swaying in the wind. Something made me look up to the sky. I remember very well, it was all flooded with silvery light. This unusual light, as if covering me, began to sink lower and lower. Finally, he came close to me. Suddenly feeling a strong jolt, I fell on my back. It seemed that my head was about to split from unbearable pain in my forehead. And then I lost consciousness. I don't know how much time has passed, but when I came to, I immediately rushed home to tell my mother about everything. Intuitively, I understood. Indeed, this day became one of the most significant days in the life of W. Geller. Reflecting on the reason for the unauthorized introduction of the SPM into the body of this child, let us recall that this phenomenon is always a consequence of the deviation from a person of the blessed divine protection. The teaching of the Orthodox Church says that the Creator provides, that is, has care, for all people without exception, good and evil, righteous and unrighteous, although more is cared for about Christians, and even more so about the righteous. See Orthodox Dogmatic Theology. Archbishop Macarius, Volume I, pp. 585 to 588, reprint 1993. That is why SPMs cannot arbitrarily infiltrate and control all people without exception, even if they are not baptized. The latter are also protected to some extent by the grace of the Creator, who is the Father of all, and therefore gives everyone his protective and enlightening grace, as stated in the documents of the Jerusalem Council of 1672. Known in our country as the Epistles of the Eastern Patriarchs on the Orthodox Faith, Part 3, and how St. Maxim the Confessor, the Holy Spirit is present in all people without exception, as the keeper of all things and the revitalizer of natural conceptions, but he is especially present in all those who have the law. Pointing out the transgression of the commandments and testifying to the person of Christ, quoted in V. N. Losky, Sketch of the Mystical Theology of the Eastern Church. M. 1991, p. 192. Thus, according to the teaching of the Church, the grace of God extends to all people, and not to some who are predetermined to righteousness and eternal bliss. Mal, Guide to the Study of Christian Orthodox Dogmatic Theology. M. Synodal Printing House, 1898, pp. 204 to 206. Of course, thanks to the cleansing in the sacrament of baptism of all sins, both personal and ancestral, as well as the fact that in the sacrament of anointing the Christian is given an additional, special gift of the grace of the Holy Spirit. A person is able to preserve himself in holiness and purity, if, of course, of his own free will not bend to sin. But, as already mentioned above, it is precisely as a result of the commission of sin that the apostasy of the grace-filled uncreated divine energies occurs. For what communion of righteousness with lawlessness? What does light have to do with darkness? What is the compatibility of the temple of God with idols? For you are the temple of the living God, 2 Cor. 6, 14 to 16. So, as long as the sin is not committed, SPM can neither harm a person, nor enter into him, the experimental confirmation of which will be given in the third part of our study. But what did the 3-year-old child sin? Why has even that little bit of grace departed from him that protects even an unbeliever from the introduction of the SPM? A sophisticated reader will ask. We find the answer to this question in the Holy Scriptures and teachings of the Orthodox Church, cx 25, J. 32, 18. The reason for this is the sins of parents and even more distant ancestors. If we try, on the basis of the memoirs of W. Geller himself, to restore the course of events that caused the entry into his body, then of a 3-year-old child, extramolecular essence, SPM, then we can, for example, assume that the boy lost his beneficial protection as a result the numerous prodigal sins of the father, who constantly met with other women, and then left his wife and child altogether. Thus, the mortal sins of the father, although we do not exclude the sins of the family, leaving the baby without grace to protect him, allowed the extramolecular entity to freely enter the body of the child. The day of its entry became the birthday of the famous Geller phenomenon, which, according to our terminology, refers to one of the specific ways of using pseudo-charismatic tactics by creatures of the parallel world. For the first time, the presence of direct contact of W. Geller with a certain extramolecular being was clearly proved by an American physicist of Serbian origin, Prof. Andrija Puharic, who also has a medical education and has hypnotic abilities. According to the memoirs of U. Geller, on December 1, 1971, A. Puharic, during a scientific experiment, put him into a state of hypnotic sleep and, in the presence of 3 witnesses, recorded on a tape recorder Geller's answers to the questions that Puharic himself asked him and Yitzhak Ben, who came with him from America. Comrade. When they played the tape, I was amazed to hear but not recognize my own voice. It really was not his voice. I.G. N. My voice said, I came here to study and now I am sitting in the dark with the Joker. I study and study, but I do not know who is teaching me. Andrea's voice asks. What are you learning? It has to do with creatures from space. But it's too early for me to talk about it. Andrea's voice. It's a secret? Yes, my voice answers, but someday the day will come when you will know everything. Then I recalled my early childhood. Then the film came to the point when I was 3 years old. And here I am talking about an incident in an Arab kindergarten, where a bright sheaf of light hit me, which made me lose consciousness. Hearing this, I tensed inwardly. The timbre of my voice on the tape suddenly became more than strange, one might even say, creepy. Hearing such changes in my voice, I came to some indescribable horror. Those who were in the room then recalled how this voice sounded, very even, mechanical, like a computer. He said that the silvery light is the power that entered me in the Arab garden. The fact that the voice, which sounded as if from W. Geller and was recorded by Puharik on a tape recorder, did not belong to the medium himself, was confirmed by the following incident told by Geller. A few days later, when I heard the call, I picked up the telephone receiver. From it came a computer voice from the tape, and in fact Geller initially considered him his IGN, which ordered me to take the camera and go with it to the indicated place in Tel Aviv. The voice claimed that there I would be able to photograph the Spectra spacecraft. Without hesitating a minute, we went to this place, which was on the Petah Tikva road. After a short wait, a noble object appeared in the sky just above the Israeli Army headquarters. In the presence of several eyewitnesses, I took a picture in which the UFO is seen quite clearly. Further, Geller describes direct contact with a certain dark formless creature, who put in his hand an ink kin from a fountain pen that disappeared several days ago during an experiment. This incident convinced Geller himself that the phenomena of teleportation and disappearance of objects are not performed by himself, but by some intelligent creature of a parallel world. And then I finally understood, writes W. Geller, that whatever these energetic forces are and whatever they represent, they do not come from me, but through me from some higher mind. If one can admit such a comparison, he says further, we act as radio receivers tuned to a certain wave. The main condition for success is faith. It works like an ignition key in a car. It opens all the inputs and outputs of energy in our body. Seeing or hearing about these unusual opportunities, a person should be interested and, most importantly, believe. It is faith, I believe, that can create a direct channel of cosmic communication. So far, few people get to this stage. I do not want to sound immodest, but I am convinced that I am constantly tuned into what is called cosmic communication. Why don't know? But maybe this is what gives me the opportunity to transfer my energy to others. And therefore, when I speak on a television program or give a lecture, for me it is first of all a good way to be a link in relation to other people. This last statement of the famous psychic quite rightly reveals the goals of intelligent beings of the parallel world, who use Geller as an agent of influence, or a kind of barker for communication, with forces outside of us. These intelligent forces, judging by the statements of both Geller himself and those who know him, use him very carefully, without clearly showing their misanthropic nature and preferring to keep the contactee in the dark about their true goals. It is enough for them, in this case, for Geller's positive authority to work for them. The four phenomena of Uri Geller. Let us now try to consider separately each category of the four Geller phenomena. Telepathy, how they do it. Before showing the mechanism of this phenomenon, we have to make a number of preliminary remarks. And although the reader has probably already understood that telepathic abilities do not belong to humans, but to beings from a parallel world, it seems to us that it is necessary to more clearly describe the way of interaction between the contactee medium and the SPM. According to many contactees, the creatures of the parallel world actively communicate with each other, and they communicate exclusively telepathically, i.e. mentally. Likewise, they talk with their medium contactees or pass on information to them. Some of the contactees, who are in regular telepathic communication with the SPM, received information from them that these beings were controlling all people living on Earth during their life. In addition, SPMs report that their number significantly exceeds the population of our planet, since the parallel world is almost unlimited. W. Geller, for example, writes, in the universe, all these intelligences certainly exist. There are millions and millions of them. However, most of the SPMs are concentrated near the ground, because their sphere of interest is related to people. Is it possible to believe the message is given here? Given. The most authoritative and ancient source of information on this topic is the Bible, which includes the Old and New Testaments. Her first books were written 3.5 thousand years, and the last, 2,000 years ago. The entire Bible, as a whole, unambiguously recognizes the existence of a parallel world, calling it the invisible world, Col. 1:16, and sometimes heaven or heaven of heaven, about which it is said, You, Lord, are one, you created the heavens of the heavens, the spiritual world, and all their host. 9:6, and also praise the Lord from heaven, praise him in the highest. Praise him, all his angels, praise him, all his armies. Psalm 148, 1-2. The parallel world, according to the Bible, is inhabited by intelligent beings that do not have a material shell. These creatures in the Bible have the general name angels, but are divided into two classes, angels of God and other angels who fell away from their creator, called demons, synonyms, evil spirits, demons, devils, trolls, gnomes, elves, undines, kobolds, genies, goblin, brownies, etc. By the way, the existence of an invisible, spiritual world, parallel to ours, in which intelligent beings, good and evil, only in its different spheres, are recognized, and all religions that have ever existed on earth. The number of spiritual beings, angels of God, is clearly stated in the description of the revelation given to the prophet Daniel in a symbolic vision. Thousands of thousands served him, that is, God, and the darkness stood before him. Dan. 7:10. The word darkness, which is used here to translate Hebrew and Greek terms, means, as in the originals, an infinite multitude, although in its second meaning it indicates a specific number, 10,000. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. After informing the reader of the preliminary information necessary for a deeper understanding of the phenomenon of telepathy in humans, psychics, hypnotists, magicians, fakirs, and illusionist mediums, let us try to comprehend the reasons for the appearance of telepathic abilities in some people. Based on following, firstly, the biblical revelation about the existence of the spiritual world and intelligent beings inhabiting it, and secondly, thanks to the analysis of a large number of written testimonies of both ancient and modern Orthodox ascetics, describing their experience of meeting with spiritual beings of a parallel world, thirdly, our own experience of dealing with the effects of SPM, fourthly, with the help of numerous data of psychopathology, and, fifthly, thanks to the study of various information received from contactees, we can draw the following conclusions. 1. Due to the constant control over each individual, as well as active communication and exchange of information among themselves, the creatures of the parallel world, ethereal and eternal, possessing absolute memory, can receive from each other any information about any person, living or long dead, and also about any events that have ever happened or are happening at the moment anywhere in the world. This is precisely the reason for the appearance of the terms information field and cosmic data bank, which were proposed by researchers who are not versed in spiritual matters who study anomalous phenomena. Now, as it seems to us, we can safely say that the storage of information of the so-called information field, or space data bank, is the memory of intelligent beings of the parallel world. 2. Creatures of the parallel world can transmit any information they know about another person or about any events directly into the consciousness of some people, either by telepathic transmission of visual images or inscriptions that appear in front of the mental eye. Hallucinatory perceptual phenomena and intraprojection, b. Either by the translation of thoughts, ideatorial automatism as part of the Kandinsky-Clairambelt syndrome in the form of mentism, c. Or by the suggestion of a voice that sounds inside the medium, verbal pseudo-hallucinesis. Since all the forms of contact and information transfer indicated here are considered by physicians as a mental pathology, in comparison with the normal psyche of the overwhelming majority of people, their study over the past 200 years has been mainly the prerogative, and, at the same time, the merit, of psychiatry. However, this science had one very significant drawback. It consisted in the fact that practically all psychiatrists were followers and confessors of vulgar materialism, which did not recognize the existence of any other form of life, except for the protein nucleic one. However, they were nevertheless, of course, right that the above-mentioned forms of contact, hallucinatory perceptual, and also carried out in the form of ideatorial automatisms, verbal or imperative pseudo-hallucinosis, are indeed pathologies for humans. All the described phenomena do not really belong to the realm of natural abilities of people, and therefore are pathology. The whole question lies only in the etiology of these pathological phenomena. The main mistake of medical materialists in understanding the genesis and essence of the pathological processes occurring in human consciousness stems from the fact that they do not take into account or even do not suspect about the possibility of external influence of the creatures of the parallel world on the consciousness and physiology of a person, and therefore cannot distinguish between selectivity, this impact, as well as its differentiation. This is the reason for the incorrectness of both nosological and syndromological classification of mental diseases. I will not stop promoting them. Returning again to the phenomenon of telepathy, using the example of the interaction of SPM with Uri Geller, we can easily understand all other similar parapsychological phenomena. So, for example, it will become clear that information about the amount of money lost by his mother was telepathically transmitted into Yuri's consciousness by those of the creatures of the parallel world who came into direct contact with him. In an interview, Yuri explained that information appears, as it were, on the screen in front of him, mind's eye. In turn, the SPM-curator of the boy could, for example, receive information about money from his colleague, that is, from the SPM who kept little Yuri's mother under constant control and, naturally, was next to her during the card game. In the book My Story W. Geller writes that this kind of information appears in my brain only for a split second. But I know for sure that these are not my inventions and not my fantasies. After all, what I see has absolutely nothing to do with what I think about at that moment. This example clearly shows that the medium does not make the slightest effort of his own to obtain information. He does not even know if he will receive it, and if he does, then when. He also does not know in advance either the nature or the content of the information that he will see on his inner screen. Another obvious proof of this we find in the same book by W. Geller, where he describes his performance in the popular television program David Dimbleby on the BBC in November 1973. In the presence of a prominent mathematician, Prof. John Taylor of King's College London University, and renowned biologist Dr. Lyall Watson, author of the book Supernatural, W. Geller had, among other things, to demonstrate his telepathic abilities. This is how he himself describes what happened. Before the start of the program, the presenter and the guests went to the next room, where they put in a carefully sealed tight envelope a pre-prepared drawing, which I had to guess during the program. I was very afraid that something would appear in the TV program in front of a huge audience. Did not fail. The medium is never sure that the SPM will want to do what he needs, as it happened more than once with Geller. IGN. I was haunted by the presence of such a prominent scientist as John Taylor, who, as I was afraid, might be skeptical about everything, even if he saw something supernatural with his own eyes. At first everything seemed to be going smoothly. I focused all my attention on the sealed envelope, closed my eyes and waited for the image to appear on the inner screen, which always appears in front of me whenever I close my eyes. Quite a little time passed, and I saw the silhouette of a sailing ship. The envelope was opened. There was indeed a drawing of a sailing ship inside. It amazed everyone. The BBC telephone service was again torn by phone calls. 14 TV viewers reported that they telepathically saw an image of a sailing ship in their minds before opening the envelope in the TV studio. The phenomenon described here is interesting in that the creatures of the parallel world in contact with you. Geller telepathically transmitted the visual image of the sailing ship not only to Geller, but also to other viewers who were exposed to their influence, in the absence of beneficial protection, through their colleagues, creatures subordinate to them, taking care of the aforementioned TV viewers. The SPM acted in the same way in the case of you. Geller's preliminary guessing of 3 numbers, first written by the medium himself, and then reproduced by a Puharich. Here the SPM acted as follows. After Yuri wrote 3 numbers on his piece of paper, his curator in a suggestive telepathic way entered this information into Puharich's consciousness. He, in turn, wrote on his sheet of paper a 3-digit number, which, as it were, arbitrarily and naturally arose in his mind. When comparing the figures, it became clear that there could be no arbitrariness of speech. The participants in the experiment realized that in this case there was a phenomenon of telepathic suggestion of other people's thoughts into the consciousness of another person. Research suggests that only beings from a parallel world can carry out telepathic transmission of thoughts and visual images. Having entered the body of a medium under certain conditions, SPM can manifest their telepathic abilities through it. By doing this, they create an appropriate image for their contactee, who is usually their agent of influence in society. W. Geller himself involuntarily says the same. It seems to me that the hype around my name is good. Thanks to her, more and more people learn about the existence of supernatural forces. And I am sure that the time will come when humanity will have to believe in them and accept them. But this latter is the necessary condition for the SPM to gain power over humanity, power, which is able to control the consciousness and behavior of a person. Elsewhere, W. Geller writes, and as long as I can continue to demonstrate these energetic forces to people, as long as they are in me, I will not stop promoting them, regardless of the controversy they cause. This is what the whole variety and lecturing activity of W. Geller is subordinated to. The example described above, suggestion of numbers to Puharich, clearly shows that SPMs can transmit any information so gently and accurately into the unprotected consciousness of a person that he is absolutely unable to understand whether a given thought or desire belongs to him, or whether they are suggested from the outside. The ability of the curators to possess information about any of the people who have ever lived on Earth allowed them to introduce into the consciousness of contactees the idea of reincarnation, that is, the idea of transmigration of souls. To substantiate this idea, which is very beneficial for them, SPM usually choose the person who is least protected by divine grace, and then, by suggestive telepathic way, they introduce into his consciousness reliable information about the once deceased person. In such a case, this information is unexpectedly remembered by a person, or, in other cases, during a hypnosis session under the direct influence of SPM. The person's vocal apparatus reproduces, speaks independently of the person's consciousness, information about the deceased being suggested to him. Psychokinesis mediums for an hour. Above, we have already talked about various phenomena that occur in the landing zones of UFOs, as well as within the so-called witch circles in grain fields. Similar phenomena are known in the Bermuda Triangle and in the Perm Zone, which are characterized by an unusual effect of unknown energy both on objects of the material world and on people, animals, and plants. However, such phenomena occur not only in these areas. Forces unknown to science, perplexing venerable scientists, can manifest themselves almost anywhere, but under one condition, as a rule. For the appearance of these phenomena unexplained by science, the presence of a medium is necessary, a person who is as open as possible to contact with SPM due to his almost complete absence of divine protection. There is no doubt that the deceleration or acceleration of the clock, as well as the start of the stopped clock, as it were, spontaneous deformation and breakage of objects, our hands, cutlery, and screwdrivers, raising the liquid column in the thermometer, etc., represent no labor. All this, and even much more complex things, they do in the above zones quite independently. In other words, all the phenomena of psychokinesis have nothing to do with the psychic abilities of a person medium, they are the direct action of the creatures of the parallel world on the material objects of the visible world. A little earlier, we asked readers to pay attention to the interesting fact of deformation of objects and the start of clocks in the houses of radio listeners during an interview with W. Geller on the BBC, as well as to the study by scientists from Cambridge under a microscope of the site of a screwdriver fracture. Let us now examine both of these phenomena. The first fact of the deformation of spoons and forks in the houses of the amazed Englishman during a radio conversation with W. Geller indicates a close interaction between the creatures of the parallel world. The unusual fact of the supernatural and instantaneous effect of some unknown force on clocks and cutlery in the homes of a wide variety of people is actually explained very simply. SPM is Geller's curator, who apparently has a very high rank in the hierarchical structure of parallel beings. World telepathically gave an order to a multitude of other SPMs controlling each of the radio listeners, ordering them to deform the cutlery or start the stopped clocks in the houses of those who were listening to Geller's interview at that hour. The least protected of them at this moment became, as it were, mediums for an hour. About that the creatures of the parallel world have a fairly clear organization with their own hierarchical structure, where the higher ranks give orders to the lower ones and send them to carry out various assignments, says the teaching of the Orthodox Church on the basis of Holy Scripture. In addition, this is evidenced by the extensive experience of the Holy Fathers and ascetics of the faith who succeeded in the struggle with these entities of a parallel world, such as, for example, Anthony the Great, Macarius of Egypt, Cyprian, and Justinian and many others. See Archbishop Macarius. Orthodox Dogmatic Theology. Volume I, pp. 376 to 413, as well as Lives of the Saints. October. Reprint 1993, pp. 38 to 46. This is evidenced by the extensive experience of the Holy Fathers and ascetics of the faith who succeeded in the struggle with these entities of the parallel world, such as, for example, Anthony the Great, Macarius of Egypt, Cyprian, and Justinian and many others. See Archbishop Macarius. Orthodox Dogmatic Theology. Volume I, pp. 376 to 413, as well as Lives of the Saints. October. Reprint 1993, pp. 38 to 46. This is evidenced by the extensive experience of the Holy Fathers and ascetics of the faith who succeeded in the struggle with these entities of the parallel world, such as, for example, Anthony the Great, Macarius of Egypt, Cyprian, and Justinian and many others. See Archbishop Macarius. Orthodox Dogmatic Theology. Volume I, pp. 376 to 413, as well as Lives of the Saints. October. Reprint 1993, pp. 38 to 46. Schizophrenia on TV. Let us dwell here on a very important fact of the interaction of many SPMs with each other in order to simultaneously influence large masses of people. Above, we have already analyzed the example of the transmission of the same visual information by creatures of the parallel world to their patients when considering the case of a fakir in a crowd of thousands of spectators at an English stadium. The same nature lies at the heart of the television phenomenon of the famous Russian sorcerer psychic Kashpirovsky, early 1990s. In this case, thanks to the massive influence of many creatures of the parallel world on the viewers at the signal of their leader, who is the curator of Kashpirovsky, thousands of people across the country experienced the phenomenon of motor automatism, which is part of the Kandinsky-Clarambeau syndrome. The bodies and hands of the people in the studio as well as many TV viewers, as it were, spontaneously, i.e. regardless of their wishes, set in motion. The specified syndrome in psychiatry is considered as the most important symptom of malignant schizophrenia. From a formal point of view, for many thousands of people, the phenomenon of motor automatism has become a manifestation of a schizophrenic process that began due to watching a Kashpirovsky session on television. In the future, many of them were forced to go to psychiatric clinics due to increased mental disorders, which began thanks to the viewing of the Kashpirovsky session on television. In the future, many of them were forced to go to psychiatric clinics due to increased mental disorders, which began thanks to the viewing of the Kashpirovsky session on television. In the future, many of them were forced to go to psychiatric clinics due to increased mental disorders. In this case, we can again observe a direct connection between the impact of the creatures of the parallel world on a person and mental disorders. It is also important to note here that all the numerous cases of mental health disorders of both TV viewers and direct participants in Kashpirovsky's sessions only indicate that most of the population of the former Soviet Union is so deprived of divine grace that it succumbs to the most malignant, i.e. pressure, the form of the impact of SPM on the psyche of people, which we talked about above. The successes of the 75-year-old triumphal march across the country of scientific atheism, as they say, are evident. Creatures of the parallel world use such interaction with each other in cases where they need to simultaneously influence large masses of people to direct the emotions or actions of the crowd in one direction. This is how they organize mass suicides. For example, on November 18, 1978 in Johnstown, Guyana, 911 members of the People's Temple sect committed suicide, and on March 27, 1997 in California, 40 members of the Heaven's Gate sect voluntarily said goodbye to their lives at the same time. The same massive impact on the consciousness of millions allows the creatures of the parallel world to feed the revolutionary activity of the masses, changing the consciousness of entire peoples during periods of revolutions and wars, during which the population of a country or several countries for a time seems to go crazy, showing inexplicable. Let us remind readers once again that all this can be done only with those people who are not protected by the grace of God, i.e. uncreated energies of the Holy Spirit. But since the grace-filled protection is given to believers through the sacraments of the Orthodox Church, preventing them from mastering the will, mind, and emotions of people, it becomes clear why the SPM hate the Church so fiercely, trying to replace the teaching of Christ with some other false teaching. If any individual or a whole people for apostasy from Christ is deprived of the grace-filled cover of the Holy Spirit, the creatures of the parallel world can freely direct his actions, the will in the direction they need, which, as we have already seen, is very far from humanism, which they falsely hide behind in messages sent through contactees. Where do these forces come from? The second feature of the psychokinetic phenomenon of W. Geller, to which the English scientist Ted Buston drew attention, indicated an inexplicable thermal effect that screwdrivers, as if by themselves, moved to the next room, were subjected to. They were not broken, but as if cut by a powerful heat beam, like a laser. A massive laser setup would be required to reproduce such thermal effects. But, as we well know, creatures of the parallel world do not need such installations, since they have energies capable of changing the structure of matter at the molecular and even more subtle level. Many famous scientists who have studied the phenomenon of psychokinesis in the laboratory conditions of the best research institutes in England, America, and Germany, excluding any focus, manual dexterity, or direct influence on the subject from W. Geller, came to the same conclusion as Prof. John Taylor from King's College, University of London, who finally became convinced that in these cases a process of qualitative change in matter took place in completely new ways. But since modern physics does not know the forces capable of this, the main problem is to determine what these forces are. When considering the phenomenon of psychokinesis, let us once again draw the reader's attention to the fact that all these phenomena, in particular, the bending of metal objects in front of the eyes of many spectators, although they usually occur in the presence of a medium, are not performed by him and, moreover, absolutely independently of him. The following examples prove this well. One of them, a meeting of old friends in New York in 1974, was told by a former classmate of W. Geller, Joseph Charles. He says, "We dined together and reminisced about the old days. Yuri was eating a fruit salad with a regular restaurant spoon, when suddenly she began to bend. You see, Joseph, what a problem I face every time I eat," he said, and tossed the spoon on the table, which continued to bend by itself until it broke. That unexpected deformations and even fractures of cutlery in Geller's hand amazed and frightened him from the very childhood. The medium says, "Once my mother made mushroom soup. At first, I dipped white bread into the soup and ate, then I began to eat with a spoon. I am left-handed and therefore held the spoon in my left hand. Mom at this time stood at the stove. As usual, I scooped up the soup and just brought it to my mouth, when suddenly the spoon broke. Imagine now that all this is happening to you. You are 8 or 9 years old, you scoop up a spoonful of soup, and suddenly the spoon breaks for no reason and spills the soup on your knees. What will you do? Well, if this repeats itself, as it happened to me, 30 or 40 times during the year, then you really start to get nervous, to put it mildly." Poltergeist jokes. As noted above, the energy allies of contactees often act on their own, although they usually try to maintain the brand of their ward in the eyes of others. They also love to joke, sometimes doing things that the medium did not even intend to do, for example, forcing objects to move unexpectedly, thereby surprising both the contactee and the audience. With such jokes, SPMs produce the effect that has received the common German name poltergeist. W. Geller also recalls these unprogrammed actions of an unknown force. Prof. Taylor moved to another room, where there was even more equipment. There, the technicians took a piece of copper and attached a very thin wire to it, which was supposed to transmit the most accurate information to the device about any changes in the metal. I had to bend metal again without touching it, but only concentrating all your efforts on it. I tried very hard, saying to myself, bend, bend, bend. However, nothing has changed. We stopped for a minute because the experiment seemed to fail. And suddenly the metal began to bend by itself, and the thin measuring wire broke. And then Prof. Taylor happened to notice that a piece of brass lying on the table at the other end of the laboratory was also bent. The professor wanted to use it for another experiment. After a while continuing to work, we suddenly heard the sound of an object falling at the far end of the laboratory, about 7 meters away from us. It turned out that the same piece of brass fell by itself to the floor next to the door. And a few minutes later, a piece of copper that was lying next to the brass also slipped off the table and landed near the door. Our surprise knew no bounds. And then there was an iron rod lying on the far edge of the table, fell right under the feet of Prof. Taylor. Moreover, this rod, which used to be straight, bent before his eyes. I was at a considerable distance from these objects and, as in many other cases, focused all my attention on something else, having no idea what would happen next. The impression was that the energetic forces were playing a little joke on us. They seemed to demonstrate some kind of their own cosmic sense of humor. And here is another testimony from the medium himself that SPMs very often act quite independently. Sometimes absolutely amazing things happen. I run my finger over a certain fork or spoon, while other utensils are bent on the table. I don't know why myself. Or, for example, the following statement by W. Geller, to be honest, things don't always go smoothly for me either. Here we are talking about experiments in the laboratory. IGN. And I feel very embarrassed because I never have 100% certainty that everything will be alright, because my opportunities do not come from me, but from some energy that is outside of me. Teleportation space clowns. V. Yashin's article cited above describes the disappearance of a box of screwdrivers from the table, at which Dr. Ted Bastin from Cambridge and the Israeli medium Uri Geller were sitting. She was then discovered in a nearby room. How this box got there, no one could understand. The phenomenon of teleportation, i.e. various phenomena of the movement of objects or even people in space, incomprehensible from the point of view of modern physics, as we will see from the story of U. Geller himself, are produced not by mediums at all, but by the same beings of a parallel world who, for one reason or another, interact with the medium. In his book My Story U. Geller says that during the third experiment, when a Puharik put him into a hypnotic sleep, an electronic voice, like a computer voice, which was recorded by Puharik on a tape recorder, sounded from Geller. The voice claimed that these energies emanate from the spacecraft and even called its name Spectra. The voice continued, the ship came from a planet 1,000 light years from Earth, and all this is being done for peace on Earth. Some complete nonsense. Why, for example, such a strange Hollywood name? What's going on with me? Maybe it's some kind of cosmic clown who is just making a ridiculous cosmic joke on us? I refused to believe all this, and therefore I had to cheer myself up with such funny thoughts. And now let's see what ridiculously insignificant tricks the aliens show, ostensibly for the sake of peace on Earth. Strange stories began to happen with the tape recorder. We put in a blank cassette, just printed, and were just about to press the play button, as the cassette began to sound, as if an invisible hand had pressed this button. An electronic voice from the Spectra spacecraft sounded from the tape. Who is the real culprit of the strange disappearance, teleportation, of various objects? It was most obvious from the story with a spray can from a fountain pen, about which W. Geller himself told. At the same time, We began a series of experiments to check whether disappearance or appearance could occur items under tight control. Andrea copied the identification numbers from the can inside the fountain pen. Then he put it in a wooden box and closed it. For several minutes, I held my hand over the box without touching it. Finally, when I sensed that something had happened, I told Bentov and Andrea to open the box and see if the pen was gone. She was in place, but when we took her to carefully examine, we found that the can, which was inside, disappeared without a trace. We have not been able to explain this. We were just surprised that only one spray can disappeared, and not the whole pen. A few days later, an electronic voice on the phone informed W. Geller that on December 7, 1971, he was to meet with a spacecraft. Together with a Puharik, they arrived at the appointed time in a suburb of Tel Aviv and near a small open area saw a bluish-white pulsing light. I was drawn to him, says W. Geller. We got out of the car and heard some kind of electronic sound, like the crackling of grasshoppers. The light pulled me towards it again. I remember that I asked my companions to stay behind, and I myself went towards the light. The closer I got, the more I felt that I was going into some kind of trance. Everything was somehow very hazy, slowed down, as if I was in some other environment. I don't know what was the matter, but even the atmosphere felt somehow different. It seemed to me that I saw some kind of structure, the shape of which I do not remember. I was in a state of some kind of semi-unconsciousness. A figure emerging from this structure, dark and shapeless, put something in my hand. I got scared. I ran back to Andrea and Iris. Even before I could reach them, I suddenly realized what was in my hands. It was the same fountain pen that so mysteriously disappeared from the wooden box. Andrea checked the serial number of the issue. It was the same number, 347,299, which he had written down during the experiment a few days ago. Before that, Andrea did not show me the number, as this was one of the control conditions of the experiment. Note here that the structure mentioned by W. Geller did not at all resemble an alien ship, it looked more like a house. And if in the described case it can be assumed that the image of a formless anthropomorphic figure together with the image of the structure was telepathically transmitted by the creatures of the parallel world directly into the consciousness of the medium. The satellites did not see anything of this, then the inhabitants of Makhachkala in November 1989 observed a similar, but completely materialized object, about which one of them, B. Hajiev, spoke as follows, I am sure that it was a material object. You could walk up to him and knock on the wall. As a builder, I will say, what I saw resembled a well-built house in each window, a searchlight flashed in turn. I think that I will not be mistaken with the dimensions, the total length is 12 meters. The object stood and began to move easily, smoothly, even gracefully. Sometimes he disappeared from sight. It seemed that he flew away. And soon they noticed him already in the crevice of the mountains. Stood and disappeared. V. Azaza. Attention, UFO. M. 1991, pp. 13-14. This observation once again shows that creatures of a parallel world can create temporary forms or objects of the most varied configurations, imitating real objects of our world, a house, a car, an airplane, a person, or an animal. Teleportation of people has also been known for a long time. One of such cases, for example, was recorded at the beginning of the 20th century, when UFOs were not even heard of, 1912. 8-year-old French woman N. played on the canal between Alès and Péronne. Suddenly, out of nowhere appeared strange creatures of tall stature, in metal spacesuits. They took the girl by force to a round object with rectangular windows and, having made her sit on a soft sofa in a bright room, disappeared. Looking around, the girl was frightened and cried. Almost immediately, a hole opened in the ceiling, and the child, not understanding how, ended up on the ground, quite far from the place from which he was abducted. V. G. Azaza, N. Vasiliev and others caution, UFO. M. 1991, p. 18. On closer examination of the phenomena of teleportation described by W. Geller, one can notice that the entity with which the medium is in contact performs the transfer of objects, screwdrivers or a spray can from a fountain pen, completely independently of itself. Moreover, in the first case, Dr. T. Baston did not even pose such a problem to Geller in an experiment on the study of psychokinesis. The sudden movement of the box with screwdrivers was an unplanned and, as it were, spontaneous, for an external observer, action of some unknown force acting without the intervention of the consciousness and will of the medium. In the second case, before the disappearance of the spray, as U. Geller admitted, he seemed to have a presentiment that something was about to happen. Intuitively, he expected the fountain pen to disappear from the wooden box, but he was quite surprised when it was in place. Neither W. Geller, nor A. Puharich, starting the experiment, knew what exactly would happen to the fountain pen and whether it would happen at all. SPM deigned to joke. It is not without reason that W. Geller often called him the space clown. Apparently, the clown himself inspired his contactee with a premonition, intuition, that something should happen if you hold your hand over the box. However, at the same time, the Joker could not refrain from demonstrating his freedom of action. And he demonstrated it by doing what Geller least thought of. Both of these cases, as well as numerous examples of teleportation of people over long distances, in many respects similar to the movement of a French girl described above, confirm the opinion that any phenomena of teleportation of objects and people have nothing to do with hidden human capabilities. The phenomenon under consideration is explained solely only by the effect on objects and humans of beings from a parallel world, which have capabilities that defy scientific explanation and are inaccessible to people. What is a medium for? It would be logical to ask why SPM very often associate their actions, supernatural for us, but not for them, with any person medium, although they could act absolutely independently. By the way, without realizing it, W. Geller has already answered this question. Here are just two excerpts from his book The Geller Effect. When I speak on a television program or give a lecture, for me it is, first of all, a good way to be a link in relation to other people, to help them accept a connection with forces outside of us. Somewhere, probably, there is a supreme intelligence that distributes this energy. And as long as I can demonstrate these energetic forces to people, as long as they are in me, I will not stop promoting them, regardless of the controversy they cause. It is quite obvious that SPM uses W. Geller as an uninitiated agent, the so-called profane, the disseminator of their main idea about the urgent need for all mankind to contact those cosmic forces that through Geller demonstrate their exceptional capabilities. As we have already noted, even interest and attention to the performance of Geller and other psychics can cause the activation of SPM curators in those people who are least protected by divine grace. Thus, Geller and co. are really fulfilling their task of being a connecting link between energy allies and people, helping them to accept a connection with forces outside of us. The activity of messengers like Geller is necessary, since not all people are open to free influence on them by SPM, which is why the need for propaganda through a contactee, as a rule, a charming guy psychic or a popular illusionist, of a person's personal appeal to these unknown forces. The creatures of the parallel world need this connection precisely because their super task, as Russian ufologists quite correctly established, is the gradual strengthening of their power over the consciousness and will of people, turning them into biorobots or zombies. Magic professionals, or is power over spirits possible? But unlike the layman in magic and, in general, a good, somewhat naive guy, Uri Geller, who himself is sincerely surprised at the forces manifested through him, among the illusionists there is another category of magicians, very well versed in the occult magical sciences, such, for example, as the famous David Copperfield, Kotkin. The main difference between these two categories is that a Geller-type medium performing on stage is not able to control the forces that he demonstrates, admitting, not from me, but from some energy that is outside of me. On the contrary, an illusionist professionally practicing magic, the Russian synonym is witchcraft, is always confident in himself, because has the ability to control forces. It is possible to gain power over the beings of a parallel world, but only under certain conditions. As a major expert on occultism, compiler of an encyclopedia of secret knowledge, Manly P. Hall, 1928, p. 368, writes about this. You can conclude an agreement with the spirits through which the magician becomes for some time, determined by agreement, domineering over the elemental spirits. After his death the magician becomes the servant of this elemental spirit. Note here that the word power, in relation to spirits, not only does not reveal, but even obscures the essence of the phenomenon. In fact, the magician, that is, the sorcerer, only thinks and believes that with the help of appropriate spells and ritual magical actions, he subjugates the spirits, demons, gaining some kind of power over them. But just the opposite happens. Thanks to his conscious appeal to the elemental spirits for help, this act is at the same time an act of man's renunciation of his creator. The creatures of the parallel world gain power over him, acquiring in his person a servant and executor of their plans, which they want to realize in the sphere of material existence. However, in order for the deception to look decent and the person to be in the illusion of his power over the spirits, the creatures of the parallel world willingly fulfill his wishes, which, for the most part, are telepathically inspired by them. At the same time, the person himself is in rapture from the feeling of omnipotence inspired by him over spirits, elements, and people. But SPM never betrays themselves, remaining disinformation and liars to the end, and therefore at the end of his life a person who has entered into a contract with them, his model is given by Manly P. Hall, is always deceived and ends his life very badly. Agents of influence for the common people and the intelligentsia. In psychics and mediums, beings of the parallel world quite consciously support a naive belief in the supreme cosmic mind, in aliens, and in cosmic energies. They constantly misinform the uninitiated into the magical secrets of people, trying to prove that they, SPM, are not demons at all, but intelligent beings from other galaxies. Psychics and mediums are the level of workers, agents of influence, that the beings of the parallel world need to work with the broad masses of people of a very low spiritual level, i.e. with the townsfolk. In turn, magicians and initiated occultists are called upon to win the attention of those who seek to understand the meaning and purpose of being, who have at least some spiritual needs. Thus, magicians and initiated occultists are agents of a higher level, working mainly with intellectuals or people who intuitively seek some kind of spirituality. In parallel with ideological work with public consciousness, corresponding to the tasks of the SPM, some of the magicians and occultists can use the help promised by the agreement with the spirits for completely earthly affairs, for example, to make money. Using the supernatural abilities of SPM, honestly, in the sweat of his brow, D. Copperfield earns a piece of bread in the field of pop art, D. Davitashvili does his business through para-healing, and with the help of clairvoyance Vanga Dimitrova from Bulgaria lived comfortably for many years. However, all illusionists and fakirs who practice magic, in contrast to naive psychics such as W. Geller, diligently keep silent about their connection with creatures of a parallel world. MP Hall calls them elemental spirits or demons, since both magicians and fakirs, as it is said that they know perfectly well with whom they communicate. It is not at all profitable for a practicing magician illusionist who knows who is who to open his connection with beings of another world, and therefore he always tries to deny it, this connection, convincing the trusting and spiritually illiterate public that his miracles are all just a trick. A trick performed with the help of the most sophisticated modern equipment. They diligently keep silent about their connection with the creatures of the parallel world. MP Hall calls them elemental spirits or demons, since both magicians and fakirs, as it was said, know perfectly well with whom they communicate. It is not at all profitable for a practicing magician illusionist who knows who is who to open his connection with beings of another world, and therefore he always tries to deny it, this connection, convincing the trusting and spiritually illiterate public that his miracles are all just a trick. A trick performed with the help of the most sophisticated modern equipment. They diligently keep silent about their connection with the creatures of the parallel world. MP Hall calls them elemental spirits or demons, since both magicians and fakirs, as it was said, know perfectly well with whom they communicate. It is not at all profitable for a practicing magician illusionist who knows who is who to open his connection with beings of another world, and therefore he always tries to deny it, this connection, convincing the trusting and spiritually illiterate public that his miracles are all just a trick. A trick performed with the help of the most sophisticated modern equipment. This is exactly how David Copperfield acts, who, taking advantage of the absolute spiritual illiteracy, who is greedy for the entertainment of the modern public, on the one hand, openly claims that he is a great specialist, and even a professor, in the field of magical art, and on the other hand, categorically denies his connection with creatures' parallel world. The paradox is that one does not exist without the other and cannot be, by the definition of the very meaning of such a concept as magic. Designed for the illiterate crowd, the recognition that the American illusionist is well acquainted with magic, but at the same time does not maintain any connections with supernatural forces, we found in two messages that are given below. For example, the Intermedia News Agency reported in September 1998, David Kutkin, Copperfield, was born on September 16, 1956 in New Jersey. He became the youngest illusionist ever to be admitted to the Society of American Illusionists. By the age of 16, he is a teacher of magic at the University of New York. The following are the words of Copperfield himself. IGN, since childhood, I was fond of reading books and textbooks on magic. He has collected the largest library of magic books, among which there is one edition dated 1584. In an interview, taken from Copperfield for the newspaper Alphabet in December 1999, Vlad Perepelitsyn quotes a magician who has arrived on tour in Moscow, who clarified, several years ago, for more than $2 million. I bought the old Mulholland Library of Magical and Related Arts. Then he confesses, I try to use both the old methods of artistic magic, and more modern, and then we see the most ridiculous of all the tricks of the famous illusionist. Which is that after frankly admitting to using the methods of artistic magic, he at the end of the publication states, I am an illusionist and do not support any connections with supernatural forces. The statement is truly anecdotal. Several years ago, I purchased the old Mulholland Library of Magical and Allied Arts for over $2 million. Then he confesses, I try to use both the old methods of artistic magic, and more modern, and then we see the most ridiculous of all the tricks of the famous illusionist. Which is that after frankly admitting to using the methods of artistic magic, he at the end of the publication states, I am an illusionist and do not support any connections with supernatural forces. The statement is truly anecdotal. Several years ago, I purchased the old Mulholland Library of Magical and Allied Arts for over $2 million. Then he confesses, I try to use both the old methods of artistic magic, and more modern, and then we see the most ridiculous of all the tricks of the famous illusionist. Which is that after frankly admitting to using the methods of artistic magic, he at the end of the publication states, I am an illusionist and do not support any connections with supernatural forces. The statement is truly anecdotal. And then we see the most ridiculous of all the tricks of the famous illusionist, which consists in the fact that after an open admission to the use of methods of artistic magic, at the end of the publication, he declares I am an illusionist and do not support any connections with supernatural forces. The statement is truly anecdotal. And then we see the most ridiculous of all the tricks of the famous illusionist, which consists in the fact that after frankly admitting to the use of methods of artistic magic, at the end of the publication he declares I am an illusionist and I do not support any connections with supernatural forces. The statement is truly anecdotal. Tricks of the Professor of Magic. Our domestic sorcerer Yuri Longo, who is hard to deny modesty and humor, in the fall of 1999 in the newspaper Argumenti I Facti commented on the miracles of the American magician, undoubtedly, Copperfield has magical abilities, I did all his tricks. And here he has not mastered my entire repertoire, he did not walk on water, oh. Kostenko, M. Ilyansky. Copperfield is flying to us. In the same article, there is confirmation of a very interesting fact, which we should also pay attention to. This is the fact of transferring the ability to contact with SPM from one relative to another, although there are cases of transferring contact to a stranger. This was openly stated by many sorcerers, including Y. Tarasov, Maria Stefania and many of those who invite readers to magic sessions in newspaper advertisements. Judging by the material collected by journalists, the ability to contact with creatures of the parallel world passed to David from his grandfather, who, before leaving for America, lived with his family in Odessa. They write, his relatives lived on Deribasovskaya. Some old-timers still remember stories about grandfather Dodik, who broke off such tricks on purpose. Analyzing in this section the problem of teleportation is one of the forms of realizing the supernatural. For people, of course, possibilities of SPM in the field of entertainment art, illusionism, it seems to us interesting to consider two well-known attractions by D. Copperfield. One of them was that the magician was supposed to appear under a red rag spread out on a huge thick steel sheet, fixed on trestles 300 meters from the residential building to be demolished. Under police surveillance and video cameras, Copperfield was handcuffed and locked in a steel safe in a house to be demolished. There was only 2 minutes between the closure of the safe with Copperfield inside and the explosion of the house in which this safe remained. This is how much time was allotted to the magician for the seemingly impossible saving of his life. The appearance of the magician was expected immediately after the explosion of the building. Indeed, as soon as an exploded multi-story building settled in clouds of dust and smoke, some movement began on the steel sheet under the flat cloth. Then the fabric began to rise, and a second later he stood on a steel sheet, throwing off the red cloth, as if out of breath. Copperfield. Another attraction was the passage of Copperfield through the famous Chinese wall, which at the place of the expected passage is at least 5 to 6 meters thick. Both magic shows were organized with a huge crowd of people and such close control, with the obligatory fixation on videotape, that any fake or trick was excluded. But since what happened in front of the audience could not be explained by any scientific theories, people, there are now the majority of them, for whom science is the ultimate truth, there was only one thing left, to accept the version proposed by Copperfield. It is very primitive and sounds something like this: "This is a very tricky trick, and you will never understand how I did it." However, as we could repeatedly see, the movement of people and objects in space in a supernatural, for us, way, that is, the most common teleportation, which, by mutual agreement with the magician, is carried out by creatures of the parallel world, for them, SPM, is the most ordinary thing. Thus, in both cases, the entire so-called illusionism of Copperfield was built on the supernatural, for us, ability of beings from the parallel world to teleport by mutual agreement between the magician and the SPM. By the way, in the above article from the newspaper, Arguments and Facts, U. Longo said that although he did not pass through the wall, but I know the art of teleportation, movement in space at the molecular level. In the same way, according to the testimony of students, the founder of Aikido, Murihei Yoshiba, 1883 to 1969, moved in space. Who simply disappeared when surrounded by opponents, and instantly appeared in another place. We should pay tribute to his honesty. Yoshiba never appropriated his achievements. He honestly admitted that he did not create Aiki himself, but that it arose by the order of Kami, Japanese, spirit, deity, which I only followed and passed on to others. I did not create Aikido. Aiki is the way of Kami, cited from Y. Vorobyevsky Step of the Snake. 1999, pp. 498 to 499. Probably, the reader has already guessed that a rational being, spirit, or deity. Do demons serve saints? But if a sorcerer, magician, illusionist, in order for a creature of a parallel world to do something at his request, it is necessary to conclude an agreement with him on the sale of a soul, which after the death of the body will go into the full disposal of the SPM. Then the holy people of God who have acquired the grace of the Holy Spirit, conjuring evil spirits in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ, forced them to serve themselves against their will. Such facts are extremely rare, because Christians did not want to have anything to do with the enemies of God, demons, but nevertheless there were such cases. It is well known, for example, an episode from the life of the Novgorod Archbishop John, 12th century AD, who, with his hierarchical authority and the power of the sign of the cross, forced such a creature, which was disgraceful in his cell, now this phenomenon is called a poltergeist, to transfer it to Jerusalem to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and then return back to Novgorod. The teleportation back and forth took place in one night, during which the Archbishop managed to prayerfully honor all the shrines of the Jerusalem temple. Moreover, as evidenced by life, SPM showed two examples of materialization and polymorphism. At first, the demon materialized in the form of an animal, horse, and then a man, girl. The biblical history also gives us the opportunity to get acquainted with the facts of teleportation, known from ancient times. These facts clearly show that the movement of people, about whom the scripture speaks, was carried out not by their own psychic power, although they were saints, but by the will of God in a supernatural way, still not known to science. They were transferred by those of the superfine beings. The world, which the Bible calls the angels of God. The New Testament, all of whose books were written in the second half of the first, the beginning of the 2nd centuries AD, that is, almost 2,000 years ago, provides us with a very expressive example of teleportation. The Acts of the Apostles, compiled by the evangelist Luke, tells how the Apostle Philip, after having made the announcement and baptism of a high-ranking nobleman, the courtier of the Ethiopian Queen Candace, was instantly transported by an angel many kilometers from the place of baptism to the city of Azot. Moreover, by the nobles themselves, this phenomenon, teleportation, was observed as an unexpected disappearance of A.P. Philip, who was just before his eyes, Acts 8, 26-40. An even more ancient example of teleportation dates back to the time of the Persian king Cyrus, 5th century BC, when the angel of God instantly transported the prophet Habakkuk from Judea to the capital of the Persian kingdom, Babylon, and then back. In this case, as in the previous one, the supernatural movement of a person over a huge distance had a completely definite, reasonable goal. Habakkuk, who at the moment before teleportation was carrying soup and bread to the reapers on the field, had, and this was the will of God, to feed this food of the prophet Daniel languishing in the pit. Dan 14, 33-40. But the Apostle Philip, after he baptized the Ethiopian nobleman, by the will of God, had to continue his apostolic ministry in the city of Azot, where the angel transferred him. Archbishop of Novgorod, having punished the demon for the disgrace he was doing in his cell. As you can see, for the last 3 cases, it is characteristic that they all have a completely definite good purpose, while the miracles of teleportation, performed by demons either by order of the sorcerer, or independently, but in the presence of a medium, are designed only to force the idle crowd open his mouth in surprise, watching an empty but spectacular sight. Levitation. What the experiments of scientists have shown. The phenomenon of levitation, described by W. Geller, attracts attention primarily by the fact that it turned out to be unexpected for the medium himself, who, without suspecting anything, calmly walked along the street. Let us recall his story. Suddenly I felt that I was being irresistibly drawn somewhere upward. I stopped feeling the weight of my body. Closing my eyes in surprise, I almost immediately opened it again and found that I was in the air and flying, rapidly approaching the windows of some veranda, one of which was covered with a mosquito net. Breaking through the net, I flew into the room and crashed on a round table made of thick glass. He rolled over, and I landed on the floor of the veranda. From V. Yashin's article, This Mysterious Uri Geller, Interreclama. It is quite obvious that the medium himself did not make any psychic efforts with the aim of taking off into the air. Everything, what happened to him turned out to be a complete surprise to him and did not depend at all on his own will. Geller was not at all going to break through the window mesh of someone's veranda in order to fly into someone else's house and wreak havoc there. Undoubtedly, the force that brought about the unexpected rise of the medium and his movement through the air was not at all his own psychic energy, as some naive people suggest, but belonged to invisible beings, contact with whom he began at the age of 3 and continues till today. An example of the fact that mediums, unlike magicians, sorcerers, do not control levitation at all, which occurs regardless of their will under the influence of forces unknown to science, was shown in his experiments by the largest English physicist and chemist. The president of the Royal Society of London corresponds to our Academy of Sciences, the creator of the radiometer and spinthariscope William Crookes, W. Crookes, 1832-1919. This eminent scientist, who discovered the element thallium with the help of spectral analysis, took the most serious way to the experiments that he conducted together with colleagues, studying the supernatural abilities of mediums. For this, first of all, it was necessary to exclude any possibility of falsification of the studied phenomena. The experiments were carried out in such a way that the tested medium could not use any devices used by magicians and illusionists. The English scientist left interesting testimonies about levitation, which he observed and studied thanks to his acquaintance with the medium known throughout Europe, D. Hume. Here is a short excerpt from his observations. At the first time of our acquaintance, he, D. Hume, sometimes said to me before the beginning of the session, "Please, William, act as if I'm a famous magician about to deceive you, do all sorts of tricks. Take all the precautions you can think of, go from place to place, look under the table and wherever you think is necessary. Don't mind me. I will not be upset. I know that the more closely they watch me, the sooner everyone will be convinced that all these supernatural phenomena are not my tricks. I have seen the most striking incidents of raising Hume into the air in my own home. One day he moved away and stood in a room separate from everyone. After standing still for a minute, he told us that he was going up into the air. I saw him slowly and smoothly rise and stop at a distance of 6 inches from the floor, about 15 centimeters, and after a few seconds quietly lowered himself. None of us moved. On another occasion, he asked me to approach him when he was 18 inches from the floor, about 46 centimeters. I ran my hands around him, under his feet and over his head, while he was in the air. Several times Hume got up with the chair on which he was sitting. This usually happened very calmly. Sometimes Hume would pick up his legs on the seat of a chair and raise his arms so that we could all see them. Once I bent down and made sure that all 4 chair legs were simultaneously in the air, and Hume's legs were on the chair. Less often, but it happened that those who were sitting near him rose into the air. One day my wife was lifted up with her chair, Rebus, no. 45 to 46, 1897. Having made sure that the phenomena of levitation and teleportation, occurring either in the presence of a medium, or with the medium itself, are real, and not imaginary, although not explicable from a scientific point of view, W. Crookes quite definitely pointed out that they are completely independent of the will medium. The scientist wrote, "I am sure that for the most part he, D. Hume, knew as much about what was to happen next as everyone present. Often he looked in a completely different direction, engaged in lively conversation, and when the phenomena began, he had to turn on them his attention, as well as others present. Everything that happened gave him, one might say, childish pleasure, and he always said that he had no power over phenomena, Ibid. You can see the similarity between the two mediums, W. Geller and D. Hume, in the fact that both of them turned out to be unconscious popularizers of contact between creatures of a parallel world and people, and both accepted unusual phenomena occurring in their presence with the same childish delight. At the same time, there is a significant difference between the explanations given to these phenomena by D. Hume at the end of the 19th century, and the considerations that were expressed in this regard by our contemporary W. Geller, born in 1946. The difference lies in the fact that if Hume, conducting spiritualistic seances, received revelations in which the SPM pretended to be the souls of people who had once died, we have already made sure that this is their usual disinformation, then W. Geller received telepathic messages that the energy that performs various miracles through him. A careful comparison of the phenomena occurring with different mediums shows that, no matter how different their explanations of the essence of what is happening, behind all these phenomena are the same entities, which, depending on time and circumstances, offer one or another version. But always false. It should be noted that since the second half of the 20th century, SPM have preferred the alien version, or the version of the thinking ether, world mind, which are more consistent with the direction of modern development of earthly civilization and the thinking of our contemporaries. Let us now consider the cases of the relationship between levitation and the appearance and impact on people of creatures from a parallel world that take the form of UFOs. Let's fly, brothers, let's fly. Many contactees talk about the fact that SPMs have the ability to lift a person into the air, even pull him into a UFO. So, for example, on March 17, 1990, a resident of Krasnodar A. Yeah. True initials, walking in the evening along the outskirts of the city, saw a huge transparent soap bubble half a meter above the grass. Then the eyewitness said, he shimmered with all the colors of the rainbow and slowly moved towards me. My legs were shackled. The ball stopped 5 to 6 meters from me, began to grow cloudy, then silver, a cellular structure of trihedrons began to be seen on its surface. Remembering from various stories that such meetings can be dangerous, I wanted to move away, but my legs did not obey me. To be honest, it became scary. Suddenly, a watermelon peel type slit a meter wide and about 3 meters high opened in the surface of the ball. Pink light flickered inside. A silver-blue dummy slowly flew out of the doorway and stood a meter away from me. He was taller than me, slender, covered with metal without a single seam. A massive head began right from the shoulders in a mound, in the center of which there was one eye, but this is more likely not an eye, but an eyepiece, because nothing moved beyond its opaque window. There was a slight whistle, something lifted me up, turned me over to a horizontal position, and I swam into the belly of the ball. I came home pale and broken. At night I vomited, scared, to the point of convulsions. My daughter has suffered with me. 3 days after I had something like instant fainting and weakness. So the humanoids thanked me, v. As I attention, UFO. M. 1991, pp. 11-12. Straight from the shoulders began a massive head in a mound, in the center of which there was one eye, but this is more likely not an eye, but an eyepiece, because nothing moved beyond its opaque window. There was a slight whistle, something lifted me up, turned me over to a horizontal position, and I swam into the belly of the ball. I came home pale and broken. At night I vomited, scared, to the point of convulsions. My daughter has suffered with me. 3 days after I had something like instant fainting and weakness. So the humanoids thanked me, v. As I attention, UFO. M. 1991, pp. 11-12. Straight from the shoulders began a massive head in a mound, in the center of which there was one eye, but this is more likely not an eye, but an eyepiece, because nothing moved beyond its opaque window. There was a slight whistle, something lifted me up, turned me over to a horizontal position, and I swam into the belly of the ball. I came home pale and broken. At night I vomited, scared, to the point of convulsions. My daughter has suffered with me. 3 days after I had something like instant fainting and weakness. So the humanoids thanked me, v. As I attention, UFO. M. 1991, pp. 11-12. My daughter has suffered with me. 3 days after I had something like instant fainting and weakness. So the humanoids thanked me, v. As I attention, UFO. M. 1991, pp. 11-12. My daughter has suffered with me. 3 days after I had something like instant fainting and weakness. So the humanoids thanked me, v. As I attention, UFO. M. 1991, pp. 11-12. The rise to a height of 50 to 55 meters above the ground was observed by the workers of the meat processing plant in Nikolov, who left on September 16, 1989 from the entrance to the tram stop. According to eyewitnesses, v. G. As described her flight as follows, at that moment she was not frightened. Her state was quasi-euphoric, even a hat shouting, "Let's fly, brothers, let's fly." In this situation, the person would have to be frightened. N. Was not afraid. It must be assumed that the state of courage was induced by psychophysical influence from a flying saucer with a diameter of 40 to 60 m, hovering nearby at a height of about a 20-story building. It was this object that was seen by the workers of the meat processing plant, who filled the area after the end of the second shift. They, by their appearance and shouts, apparently, saved N, whom an invisible ray had already raised from her native land, v. As UFO, psychophysical aspect. M. 1991, with 26. Another similar incident occurred in the late 1980s in the city of Stupino near Moscow. Children, brother, and sister, went to see some unusual balls that their peers told them about. For a week, the balloons have appeared over the boarding school. And so, when they looked at the balls, my sister began to slowly rise up, but my brother managed to grab her by the legs, held her. V. As N. Vasiliev, L. Vainjarava, D. Guryev, A. Zyusko. Caution, UFO. M. 1991, p. 26. The creatures of the parallel world, under certain favorable circumstances for them and in previous centuries, were able to lift people and objects into the air, which has been known since ancient times. So, for example, the ancient historian E.G. Sippus, 2nd century, the author of memoirs, Apomata, as well as church authors who lived in the 2nd century Irenaeus of Lyons and Justin the philosopher, and later, Simeon Metaphrast, 10th century, write about an extremely strong in the magical art of the Samaritan Simon, nicknamed the sorcerer. Anastasius of Nicaea testifies that Simon the Magus not only flew through the air, but made the statues move, entered the fire without burning, made various transformations in front of people, probably due to the suggestion of false visual images. And furniture in his house moved by itself, modern poltergeist. The Roman Emperor Nero, 54 to 68, was literally captivated by the miracles of magic, which Simon delighted his many spectators and admirers with. However, the hypnotic effect that Simon had on large crowds of people through constant contact with the SPM, remember the fakir at the London Stadium, was invariably destroyed in the presence of the Apostle Peter, who repeatedly denounced him as a lie in front of all the people. Not enduring the shame, but at the same time trying to make a good face at a bad game, Simon Magus decided to retire from Rome, but retire in triumph. He announced that since the Romans do not believe in him as a son of God, he will ascend from them to heaven and send down great executions on the city for believing the words of Apostle Peter, not him. Speaking from the roof of one of the tallest buildings in the center of Rome, Simon, with a wave of his hands. At this time, the Apostle Peter began to publicly pray to God, Lord Jesus Christ, my God, expose the witchcraft of this sorcerer, so that those who believe in you will not be tempted. Following this short prayer, the apostle, in the name of Jesus Christ, ordered the demons to leave the sorcerer and not support him anymore. This was enough for the unseen spirits to leave the flying magician. For Simon, the show ended very badly. He quickly flew down and crashed on the pavement, and the next morning he died without repentance. See, Lives of the Saints. M. 1913, Book X. You will never know about this. The famous modern magician, entertaining people with a similar spectacle, the aforementioned David Kotkin, Copperfield, turned out to be more cautious than his ancient compatriot. Although all tickets for his performance at the Moscow Olympic Stadium were sold out, tickets cost from 500 to 10,000 rubles, the magician unexpectedly for everyone and even for his personal manager decided to cancel his performance on the very day of the performance, December 10, 1999. Dejected crowds of people who came to the show learned about it from the loudspeakers of the huge stadium. Copperfield's monetary losses were enormous, but life was dearer. Radio and television announced that the illusionist refused to name the reason for canceling the show, telling reporters, "You will never know about this." Thus, of the 3 announced days, 10, 11, and December 12, 1999, Copperfield entertained our compatriots with his amazing flights over the stadium arena only on the last 2 days, Saturday and Sunday. We dare, however, assume that we know the reason for such a strange and unexplained by the illusionist of the cancellation of the performance, although he could easily explain it, referring, for example, to poor health. According to our information, the events unfolded as follows. Several Orthodox priests known to us personally, having learned about the arrival of the famous magician in Moscow, agreed among themselves to buy tickets and go to his performance. During the flight of the magician over the arena, they decided to jointly pray to God for the deliverance of already spiritually blind people from the seduction of demonic miracles. As we, not without reason, believe that the demons, who have the ability to almost instantly move in space, not wanting to lose such a useful employee for them, warned the magician in time about the trouble awaiting him. On Friday morning, having served the Divine Liturgy on the occasion of the celebration of the icon of the sign, December 10th, Ost, and having received communion, the priests asked all their familiar clergy, laypersons and monastics, to pray for God's help during the upcoming duel in the evening. 17 o'clock went to the show. However, the SPM prudently decided not to join the fight on Friday, knowing that on Saturday and Sunday the priests would not be able to attend the performance, because on Saturday evening they will certainly serve the all-night vigil, and the next day, the liturgy and various services. Copperfield wisely cancelled the first of his 3 shows in Moscow. Indeed, It was only after the priests had left for their parishes that the illusionist was able to give 2 performances on Saturday and Sunday, but as Orthodox journalists who attended the performance told, Copperfield did not show even half of what was promised. In addition, carefully observing the magician hovering through the air, they were able to make sure that his flight was not a trick using any technical means and devices, but a real levitation. By the way, the magician himself emphasized this in every possible way, showing that no invisible threats supporting him did not exist, as they did not exist, of course, during the time of Emperor Nero. To verify this, the assistants rotated 2 metal hoops around the hovering Copperfield so that his body was inside the sphere formed by their rotation. Then the illusionist flying over the stage descended from above into a huge glass box, after which a heavy lid was pushed behind him. Of course, ropes were out of the question. Copperfield broke away from the bottom of the box and swam, changing positions inside it, even upside down. Another early evidence of levitation was left to us by the ancient historian Eusebius, who reported that the famous Alexandrian philosopher, head of the Syrian school of Neoplatonism, Iamblichus, c. 250, c. 330, who wrote a treatise on the Egyptian mysteries. Their goal is the initiation of the initiate, i.e. connecting him to constant contact with the SPM, was once lifted into the air by an unknown force. When the disciples told him about this, he did not believe them. Apparently, the philosopher experienced at this moment a temporary loss of consciousness, the so-called absence, FR. Absence, in psychiatry, short-term depression or blackout with subsequent amnesia. Another case of levitation, described by Mr. Urliffe in the magazine Rebus, No. 27, 1884, is interesting in that the originator of the flight, SPM, appeared to the boy in the form of a bald, barefoot old man. Here is the story. This extremely mysterious incident was recorded in my father's calendar and marked in 1837, June 18th, 24 minutes of the first hour after midnight. At that time I was 8 years old. Once in the summer, when our whole family lived in the village of Speshnevka, Senjilievsky district of the Simbirsk province, I slept in my nursery, which was on the 2nd floor of a very large house, and the door from this room opened onto an unlocked and open balcony facing the garden, near which the Sviaga River flowed. The night I am writing about was rather dark and stifling, a thunderstorm was gathering, distant peals of thunder were heard, and a strong lightning shone. Awakened by thunder, I sat up in bed and suddenly, when lightning illuminated the room, to my horror I saw that 2 steps from my bed on the balcony, holding the handle of the glass door, was a tall, gray-haired bald old man with a gray beard, in a long blue shirt and barefoot. Struck by an instantly invincible panic fear, I rushed headlong down the stairs to the garden, and ran towards the river. Awakened by the noise of my footsteps, Vasily Kondakov, a footman, who was sleeping in the hallway, and another servant, ran after me. What happened to me further I don't remember. The people who ran after me, Vasily Kondakov and Fyodor Plotnikov, and especially the gardener Nikolai Ermakov and the blacksmith Arkhipov, who swam across Sviaga, swore by oath that they clearly saw how I was quickly carried through the air across the river almost on a par with the water. They just could not pinpoint the place where I fell, but they found me in the bushes no more than 10 minutes later along the crossing over the Sviaga, since the continuously shining lightning well illuminated the entire nearby area. 21 meters. IG. N, and a depth of fathoms, 1.76 m, and the nearest bridge is located 3 miles from the house. I lay in the broom bushes, as I had been from sleep, in one shirt and completely dry. They brought me back to consciousness very soon by spraying water. This story once again convinces us that both levitation and teleportation are not specific manifestations of the will and latent psychic energy of a person, on whom they do not depend at all. Moreover, a subject who has undergone such an effect of SPM may not even be aware of what happened if he is not told what happened to him when he was in a state of absence, short-term blackout. Why do they fly out of the temple? The following incident, told by one of the eyewitnesses of the event to the author of these lines, once again clearly shows who is actually the real culprit and the cause of a person's weight loss, levitation, or even flight. In the summer of 1982, at 5 o'clock in the morning, in the Dormition Church of the Pskov-Petchersk Monastery, As usual, Archimandrite Adrian began to perform the prayer follow-up for deliverance from the violence of unclean spirits, which is popularly called lecture. The temple was overcrowded. When the recitation of incantatory prayers began, a deafening lion's roar was heard from a young man of about 25 years old who had been brought to the monastery to give a lecture to the monastery. His head, like a propeller, began to rotate rapidly, and his body, crushed from all sides by a large number of people, began to perform oscillatory movements, as if pushing the crowd towards the exit. At this time, terrifying, bestial screams burst from him. "Stop reading! It burns me! It hurts me!" But he did not manage to get out. Too many people stood in a dense wall between him and the door. And then, in front of the amazed people, the young man, like a cartridge, having left the clip, flew up vertically from the crowd, and then, by the action of the same force, assumed a horizontal position in the air. With a terrible growl, "I hate you, Adrian." He flew out the open door out of the temple. It is quite obvious that the creature of the parallel world, some naive people call it cosmic energy or universal life force, Reiki, could not stand the incantatory prayers that, with the special blessing of the bishop, are read over people possessed by demons, some of the clergy. Unable to squeeze the body of the man occupied by him through the dense ring of the crowd, this evil creature, scorched by the grace of God, was forced with the cry, "Stop reading! It burns me! It hurts me!" But it turns out that levitation served the Roman Catholic inquisitors, who successfully used it as a diagnostic tool that allows them to almost accurately distinguish a magician, sorcerer, witch, from an innocent person slandered in imaginary witchcraft. So, for example, in Wienerische Zeitung, No. 67 of 1728, it was reported, after recently in Sejidin several persons were arrested on charges of sorcery, then, according to the local custom, they were tested. Namely, after they had floated on the water, like a shoe tree, from which wooden shoes are made. IgN, they were put on a scale to be weighed. At the same time, it is surprising that a large fat woman weighed no more than 1.5 lots, about 19 g. Her husband, who was also not a small one, had 1.25 lots, 16 g. The rest, in general, weighed from 1. In order to avoid mistakes and be completely sure that the accused of witchcraft really floats on the water, like a cork, without making any movements necessary to hold the body of an ordinary person on its surface, the suspect's thumbs and toes were tied, the right one, to the right, and the left to the left. In this position, the witch, sorcerer, was lowered into the water, and they actually lay on it, not sinking, like fallen leaves. As it turned out, a decrease in human weight, levitation, can also be one of the important evidence of a direct causal relationship, or rather, the dependence of some mental illnesses on the impact on the human psyche and physiology from invisible creatures. Not guessing about the essence of the phenomenon, this relationship was discovered by the famous Russian physiologist, founder of the Kazan School of Physiologists, professor, and then the rector of Kazan University N.O. Kovalevsky, 1840 to 1891. Once he set himself the task of finding a characteristic feature by which one could accurately distinguish true epilepsy from feigned, simulated. Kovalevsky got the idea to study the body weight of an epileptic before and after a seizure. It turned out that in small epileptic seizures, the weight loss of the epileptic can reach 2 to 9 pounds, 0.8 to 3.6 kilograms, and during large, extended, epileptic seizures, up to 12 pounds, about 5 kilograms. The scientist noted that the drop in body weight also depends on the duration and intensity of the seizure, sometimes increasing to 1/4 of the body weight of an actual epileptic. After the seizure ends, his body weight quickly recovers. Research has also shown that despite the most skillful imitation of epileptic seizures, the body weight of the simulant does not actually change. The analysis of numerous examples of supernatural weight reduction of objects and people showed that the cause of levitation is the direct impact on them from the creatures of the parallel world, using for this energy not yet known to science, conditionally, anti-gravitational effect. Thus, the indicated sign, levitation, can indeed serve as a symptom of an increased effect of SPM on a person, i.e. such an impact that SPM is used both in pseudo-charismatic tactics and in pressure tactics. And yet, Despite the fact that this characteristic sign really reveals the presence of a demonic influence on a person, the inquisitorial fathers could, alas, make mistakes, if to determine a person's involvement in magic, i.e. to accuse him of constant and conscious contact with unclean spirits. Only the sign of levitation was used. As shown by the research of N.O. Kovalevsky, levitation is characteristic not only for sorcerers, as conscious agents of the influence of evil spirits in human society, but also for people possessed by evil spirits, i.e. those unfortunates who were subjected to pressure from the SPM with the aim of their moral, spiritual, and physical destruction. This means that if you do not take into account other signs that clearly indicate a conscious contact and interaction of a person with SPM, then there is a danger of being accused of witchcraft by a mentally ill person who suffers from the attack of demonic forces, but is not a conscious sorcerer. Levitation is characteristic not only for sorcerers, as conscious agents of the influence of evil spirits in human society, but also for people possessed by evil spirits, i.e. those unfortunates who were subjected to pressure from the SPM with the aim of their moral, spiritual and physical destruction. This means that if you do not take into account other signs that clearly indicate a conscious contact and interaction of a person with SPM, then there is a danger of being accused of witchcraft by a mentally ill person who suffers from the attack of demonic forces, but is not a conscious sorcerer. Levitation is characteristic not only for sorcerers, as conscious agents of the influence of evil spirits in human society, but also for people possessed by evil spirits, i.e. those unfortunates who were subjected to pressure from the SPM with the aim of their moral, spiritual and physical destruction. This means that if you do not take into account other signs that clearly indicate a conscious contact and interaction of a person with SPM, then there is a danger of being accused of witchcraft by a mentally ill person who suffers from the attack of demonic forces, but is not a conscious sorcerer. Spiritual and physical destruction. This means that if you do not take into account other signs that clearly indicate a conscious contact and interaction of a person with SPM, then there is a danger of being accused of witchcraft by a mentally ill person who suffers from the attack of demonic forces, but is not a conscious sorcerer. Spiritual and physical destruction. This means that if you do not take into account other signs that clearly indicate a conscious contact and interaction of a person with SPM, then there is a danger of being accused of witchcraft by a mentally ill person who suffers from the attack of demonic forces, but is not a conscious sorcerer. Granny is a spoiled girl. A very revealing case of levitation, which reveals the ability of the SPM to lift not only various objects into the air, but also people, was told by the priest of the cathedral in Magadan, Fr. Sergius. It took place in the winter of 1992 in Magadan and clearly shows that the creatures of the parallel world sometimes gladly demonstrate all the wonders of the stage miracle workers on their own, without the mediation of any illusionists. Once, after the divine liturgy, a police patrol brought a boy to our church, who, sobbing, begged to consecrate the apartment where his family lives, because everything in their house flies and moves. The militiamen, in turn, said that, having come to them on call, at first they did not believe the story of the boy's parents and threatened that if they continued to harass the militia, they would be immediately taken to a psychiatric hospital. But as soon as the outfit was about to leave the apartment, the unimaginable happened. Everything that could rise into the air took off and began to rush around the room with incredible speed. Forks, knives, plates, cups, shoes, kettle, and slippers were flying. At the same time, oddly enough, sharp objects, flying near the face, managed not to hurt anyone. The alarm clock, breaking through the window glass, flew out into the street. Realizing that in such incredible circumstances they would not be able to help the victims in any way, the police reminded that there is a church in the city and offered to seek help from the priests. The boy, frightened by the terrible vision of the demon, whom he alone saw, fearing to stay in the apartment, begged the police to be taken with them to the church. He got dressed and left the apartment, accompanied by 4 young broad-shouldered guys. Then something very unusual began. On the landing between the 5th and 4th floors, the boy's legs suddenly lifted off the floor, and he found himself in a horizontal position. The militiamen did not have time to come to their senses, as the teenager, having broken through the glass of the window in the stairwell with his feet, swam into the hole formed right into the street. They grabbed him by the arms, by the shoulders and, overcoming considerable resistance of some unknown force, dragged back to the landing. Without letting go of the boy anymore, they ran downstairs and in a police UAZ car rushed to the cathedral. On a bend in the city center, the steering wheel and accelerator pedal suddenly jammed. Without slowing down, the car that lost control crashed into a huge snowdrift, which saved the lives of its passengers. Green with horror, the militiamen, having abandoned the UAZ at the scene, rushed to the church, which could be seen at the end of the street. The next day, all the police officers who had not yet been baptized came to our church and were baptized. Green with horror, the militiamen, having abandoned the UAZ at the scene, rushed to the church, which could be seen at the end of the street. The next day, all the police officers who had not yet been baptized came to our church and were baptized. Green with horror, the policemen, having abandoned the UAZ at the scene, rushed to the church, which could be seen at the end of the street. The next day, all the police officers who had not yet been baptized came to our church and were baptized. It soon became clear that the poltergeist in the house began after a violent scandal that occurred between the boy's grandmother and his parents. Leaving, the offended grandmother angrily threatened that she would punish her son and daughter-in-law according to her merits. In the village where she lived, it was said that the grandmother dabbled in witchcraft. Here we must remember that in houses where poltergeist phenomena were observed, ufologists, who studied this phenomenon using thermal imagers sensitive to infrared radiation in the wavelength range from 5 to 15 microns, saw an infrared image of creatures invisible to the eye on monitors. Continuously transformed their appearance from an amoeba or spherical cloud to humanoid figures or animal-like monsters. In these cases, images of creatures changing the form of a parallel world are recorded on photographic film sensitive to infrared radiation in the near-infrared spectrum, usually with a D22 aperture with a shutter speed of 40 to 50 seconds during the day and 4 to 5 minutes at night. In some cases, the materialization of SPMs was observed, passing from the invisible to the visible part of the spectrum. In cases like this, due to the fact that SPMs quickly gain physical density, they could even be observed visually, without instruments. Often, SPMs were shown in the form of a whitish, shapeless, changing shape of a cloud, which in a darkened room could emit a soft glow. Sometimes the cloud acquired human contours and became what in everyday language people usually call a ghost, and in other cases it condensed to a completely tangible human figure, which, at the request of the experimenters, could perform various actions and even leave plaster casts of the face and hands in advance. Vessels prepared for this with liquid gypsum, CVP by Koff. Spiritualism before the Court of Science, Society, and Religion. M. 1914. A cloud that changes its shape, which in a darkened room could emit a soft glow. Sometimes the cloud acquired human contours and became what in everyday language people usually call a ghost, and in other cases it condensed to a completely tangible human figure, which, at the request of the experimenters, could perform various actions and even leave plaster casts of the face and hands in advance. Vessels prepared for this with liquid gypsum, CVP by Koff. Spiritualism before the Court of Science, Society, and Religion. M. 1914. A cloud that changes its shape, which in a darkened room could emit a soft glow. Sometimes the cloud acquired human contours and became what in everyday language people usually call a ghost, and in other cases it condensed to a completely tangible human figure, which, at the request of the experimenters, could perform various actions and even leave plaster casts of the face and hands in advance. Vessels prepared for this with liquid gypsum, CVP by Koff. Spiritualism before the Court of Science, Society, and Religion. M. 1914. All these long-term studies, which provided a huge amount of factual material, clearly show that the cause of poltergeist and levitation, weight loss of objects, are all the same old acquaintances of ours, creatures of a parallel world, who, as already noted, at the request of a conscious contactee, i.e. magician-sorcerer, and in the latter case, grandmothers, can make the life of the inhabitants of a house or apartment absolutely unbearable. We have already considered a similar case in the town of Yenikievo, Donetsk region. However, one should not think that SPMs are creatures that have a kind of subtle body, for example, plasma, as some scientists who study anomalous phenomena believe. The analysis of numerous data concerning various methods of the impact of SPM on a person allows us to say that In order to drive out the unbelted SPM from the house, the Holy Church since ancient times used special prayers to drive out evil spirits, otherwise, demons, fallen angels, unclean spirits. These prayers are performed by the priest after a special preparation, which includes a one-day fast for him, confession of sins to his spiritual father and the celebration of the divine liturgy, during which he partakes of the holy mysteries of Christ. The inhabitants of the house, apartment, who were attacked by evil spirits, should also prepare for the expulsion of demons. They should also fast for 1 day, confess all their sins to the confessor and do, of course, according to their capabilities, alms to those in need. After the end of the divine liturgy, the priest comes to the house and performs a special prayer sequence, which is contained in the Missal of Metropolitan Peter Mogila or in a separate publication on the basis of the specified missal, followed by the prayer for deliverance from unclean spirits, the Blogofist Foundation together with the Trinity Sergius Lavra Compound, Moscow. 1999. On condition of sincere repentance of the sins of the inhabitants of the restless house, the grace of God, through the prayers of the priest, expels unclean spirits and frees the house or apartment from all types of poltergeist. A series of experiences for the curious. Mentioning here about divine grace and remembering what a destructive effect she had on the miracles of the Ceylon fakir through the prayer of Fr. Nikolai Drobiazhin, and also through the prayer of a believing teacher, a telepathic hypnotist, we could suggest that scientists who study parapsychological phenomena invite Orthodox priests to their experiments. Our experience shows that an object consecrated by the prayer of an Orthodox priest and sprinkling with holy water does not lend itself to telekinesis or teleportation, and the phenomena of telepathy do not work in the presence of any praying Orthodox person. We would even suggest interested scientists to conduct, for example, an experiment with the so-called people magnets, to whose body various pieces of iron and reinforced concrete blocks stick. You can even conduct not one, but a series of experiments. 1. Put a priest next to such a person, asking him to read aloud the 90th Psalm or the prayer, "May God rise and be scattered around him." 2. Before starting the experiment, ask the priest to consecrate all the objects that are supposed to be used, but so that the sticking person does not know about it. 3. Ask the priest to sprinkle incense on a person with paranormal abilities before the start of the experiment. 4. Ask to sprinkle it with holy water. 5. Before the start of the experiments, ask the priest to consecrate the room. 6. Sprinkle holy water on the fire walker before he goes on a pleasant walk on hot coals. Please, the experimenters, invite an ambulance carriage in advance. 7. Before passing over the coals, scatter incense consecrated by an Orthodox priest over the coals, without informing the fire walker about it. 8. Invite a psychic healer to diagnose an Orthodox person who, during the entire experiment, will read the Jesus prayer to himself, or the 90th Psalm or the prayer, "May God rise again." One of the main living Russian ufologists, Vladimir Georgievo-Kazachny, who back in the 70s headed research at the headquarters of the Navy on the topic, hydrospheric aspect of the UFO problem. We would suggest to conduct an interesting experiment together with British colleagues on the famous Loch Ness. It is well known that the elusive monster, nicknamed Nessie, has been preventing not only English eccentrics from sleeping well for many decades, but also great scientists who have repeatedly installed sophisticated equipment at various points of the lake, trying to grope and track this amazing hydrosphere object. But the trouble is, the most sensitive equipment does not give any results, as if Nessie regularly falls through the ground. In Russia, a similar case was observed in the first half of the 16th century on Lake Abramov, which is located 2.5 kilometers from the Boldino Monastery in the Dorogobuz district of the Smolensk region. The hydrosphere object that settled in the lake terribly frightened the surrounding residents, tore the nets of fishermen, and drowned some of them in front of the amazed comrades. The founder and first abbot of the Boldin Monastery, the monk Gerasim, decided to help the local residents to consecrate the lake. He performed a prayer service with the brethren, and then all night, without closing his eyes, prayed for God's help in his endeavor. In the morning, says his life, the monk Gerasim sets off to the lake with his monastery catchers and sees that it is agitated, although the day was clear and there was no wind at all. Reverend, standing by the lake, turns with fervent prayer to the Lord of Forces and remains in his prayer mood for a long time. The prayer of Saint Gerasimos had not yet ended, when from the depths of the lake there were heard sounds of extraordinary power, like thunderclaps, and went, rolling along the crests of the waves, along the river flowing through the lake. The monk did not stop praying, and suddenly a deathly silence reigned on the lake. The fishermen, at the command of the saint, cast their nets and caught a multitude of fish. Since that time, horror has never been crowded in the souls of the fishermen. They calmly and fearlessly performed their work. The life of the monk Gerasim, the wonder worker of Boldinsky. Moscow, 1893, pp. 30-31. This precedent for solving the problem associated with the hydrosphere object gave us direction to conduct an experiment in the Glenmore Valley, on the Scottish Loch Ness. We believe that the results of such experiments with hydrospheric objects, as well as with mediums, psychics, and telepaths, will open the eyes of many to who actually possesses paranormal abilities, by whose power the miracles described above are performed, and what kind of hydrospheric object is hidden under the gentle name Nessie. Hence, once again it becomes clear the reason for the hatred of the creatures of the parallel world and their earthly servants towards Christ and the Orthodox Church, which can really protect a person from the enslavement of his consciousness and will by those intelligent beings who prefer to hide under the names of the Supreme Cosmic Mind, aliens, or aliens. In conclusion of this section, on levitation, we emphasize once again that unlike mediums, for example, D. Hume or W. Geller, who are not able to control the phenomena of levitation, teleportation, etc., magician illusionists, such as D. Copperfield, by agreement with the creatures of the parallel world, they can perform actions with the help of SPM, which from the outside look like arbitrary, depending only on the will and desire of a person. Horned jokers. Summing up the studies of the ways of self-realization of beings of the parallel world in the pop art of illusionism, we will try to summarize our considerations about the incentives that force SPM to resort to this form of self-realization. We will point out here three main ones. 1. It is noticed that among the creatures of the parallel world, like people, there are big differences not only in the levels of knowledge, but also in the character properties of individuals. Among them there are those who get great pleasure from various jokes that cause surprise, bewilderment, or fear in people. With special pleasure, apparently, SPM fool serious scientists who, due to their complete spiritual ignorance, are looking for the causes of supernatural phenomena where they cannot be. Observing their experiments and the conclusions made by pundits, SPM, apparently, get a huge, almost aesthetic pleasure, having fun, and mocking the stupidity of these clever people. 2. With the help of the art of illusionism, SPM help the magician, sorcerer, who has entered into an agreement with him, to achieve the goals that are desirable for him. In this way, fame can be achieved, as well as a pleasant, for a person of a certain mentality, a sense of power and control of the emotions of numerous enthusiastic spectators, and in addition, flattering attention of the press, the crowd, and especially numerous fans. A list of Copperfield's mistresses, for example, given in Italian press, exceeded 300. But in addition to moral pleasure, SPM with the help of illusionism help the magician make good money, moreover, earn in a way that is pleasant for this person. It should be noted that for the pseudo-charismatic influence, which finds its expression in the form of illusionism, beings of the parallel world are chosen from people. 3. Having received wide fame and a reputation as a kind of shirt guy that evokes a wave of sympathy and boundless trust among the inhabitants, the illusionist becomes a good advertisement for hidden human capabilities, which, as it is said or implied, seems to be in every person and just need initialization from the cosmic mind, as W. Geller, for example, has repeatedly stated. Let us recall some of his statements. I finally understood that whatever these energetic forces are and whatever they do not come from me, but through me from some higher mind, and as long as I can continue to demonstrate these energetic forces to people while they are in me, I will not stop promoting them, regardless of the controversy that they cause. Naturally, this propaganda includes the idea of the need for contact with the cosmic mind, which, in fact, all the contactees mentioned above are vying with each other, working as a bait or, otherwise, a living illustration of the supernatural abilities that a person opens up when connected to the cosmos, the illusionist medium must arouse in the audience the desire to get the same abilities, the desire to feel like a Superman. Again, we are convinced that SPM, unable to connect any person to contact on their own, without his will and desire, are forced to look for ways to make a person voluntarily strive for this contact. It is to the excitement of this desire that the miracles of illusionists, fakirs, and psychics serve. The latter will be discussed later. To conclude the topic of self-realization of SPM in the art of the original genre, we invite our readers to independently analyze a very interesting message about the illusionist from India, Sorker Jr., who at one time conquered all the capitals of the Soviet Baltic, which was published in the newspaper Trud on September 20th, 1985 year. We believe that the reader will be able to independently determine by what methods the SPM achieved this or that effect in the tricks of the illusionist. So, what did a correspondent from Vilnius report about 15 years ago? On July 27, 1980, in a resort town near Singapore, thousands of spectators witnessed a unique spectacle. First, a man in some swimming trunks climbed into a bag, which was immediately tied tightly. Then he was placed in a box of cobblestones, nailed down with 3-inch nails, and the walls were reinforced with steel sheets. Then they were attached to a helicopter and thrown into the sea from a height of 30 meters. After 40 seconds, under a thunderous ovation, the smiling face of a prisoner appeared on the surface. And here we are talking with Pradip Chandra Sorker, the man who performed at Sorker Jr. is a quite modern magician. This 39-year-old magician has won awards from 47 international competitions and festivals for illusionists. And although the conversation dragged on, I ask him to tell about that trick in Singapore. The wizard takes my handkerchief. Imagine, this is the box in which I was sitting. She rolls it up in a tube, ties one knot and asks me to tighten it tighter. Then the second, third, fourth. Believe me, I tried my best, even helped with my teeth. Then the magician asked to raise the handkerchief over the table and throw it. I have faithfully followed his instructions. The handkerchief has already fallen on the table without a single knot. And then there was the play magic. At least 2 buckets of water poured out of a jug with a capacity of 100 milliliters. Flocks of white pigeons appeared in empty baskets. Out of thin air, a person of ordinary height turned into a dwarf. On stage, a regular chalkboard. The spectators, among whom was myself, carefully covered the eyes of the illusionist with dough and tied them with an opaque scarf. Nevertheless, he immediately repeated on the blackboard the series of numbers, mathematical and chemical formulas they had written, and even the girl's name written in Lithuanian. The sleeping princess, who had just been lying on the platform in the middle of the stage, suddenly finds herself in her locked transparent sarcophagus, standing on the edge. From a small box, into which the illusionist himself barely fit, a dozen ghosts suddenly appear. But can you tell everything? But the funniest thing was that a correspondent from Vilnius A. Solarev called his note, "Miracles without miracles." It remains only to be amazed at how strong the belief of an atheist that nothing more than this visible world exists, and therefore, there can be no supernatural phenomena. Indeed, seeing they do not see, and hearing they do not hear, and they do not understand. Matthew 13:13. Extrasensory form of self-realization SPM. How JMPs use good impulses. Let's start the new chapter with an unusual conversation. It took place in the summer of 1990 at the entrance of the former grain warehouse. Just a couple of months ago, an ordinary checkpoint began to be called a gatehouse at the temple, which, for the last 25 years it served as a mill for mixed feed and was just returned to the believers. Here, in this small hut, the author temporarily settled, and at that time, the rector of the community and the temple, which was to be restored. Unexpectedly, a well-known psychic from the regional center, a stocky young man of 32 to 34 years old, came here. The prosperous psychic began to be troubled by doubts about the origin of his abilities and the subsequent results of treatment, although the initial results seemed to give cause for optimism. We will cite here only a part of the conversation between the priest and the psychic, which reveals the direct causal relationship between the emergence of extrasensory abilities and contact, even unconscious, with a UFO. How to create an image of a psychic. Tell us, please, When and under what circumstances did you develop supernatural abilities? It was in the conclusion. I was in a camp for stealing a motorcycle. He was young and stupid and very sympathetic. He considered friendship the most important in life and was ready for anything for friends. Once they asked me to steal a motorcycle for them to ride. I was convinced that nothing could be denied to a friend. I stole a motorcycle for them, and soon I was arrested. One morning, as always before the roll call and divorce to work, we were lined up on the square near the barracks. Suddenly, someone noticed an approaching UFO squadron. Both the guards and the prisoners threw their heads up, observing in surprise an unusual sight. A lot of plates flew over us in a clear formation, forming a triangle, and each plate, strictly observing its distance from the others, made smooth oscillatory movements vertically. From that day on, I discovered that something had happened to me. What exactly did you feel? At first, I noticed that as soon as I think about something, it immediately comes true. Well, for example, a convoy leads us to work. Suddenly I have a thought, this one is about to stumble. And sure enough, the escort I'm looking at stumbles and falls. Another time, the boss gets sick. Indeed, he fell ill. All this went on day after day, so that they began to consider me almost a prophet. Then, no one knows where and why I got the feeling that if I hold my hand over the sore spot, the person will feel better. And so it happened. Now I have my own office in the clinic and there is no end to patients. Money pours in on its own. I don't know where to put them. I walk down the corridor, and people themselves put money in my dressing gown pocket, so that I can accept it. Do you have any medical education? All my education is 8 grades of high school. The first 4 years he studied well, and then he became lazy. He barely finished school. Do you know where the kidneys, liver, pancreas are located? Of course not. I have not studied anatomy. How do you manage to make the correct diagnosis? It's just that I hear a voice inside myself, which tells me that a person is in pain, and even sometimes calls his name, age, and so on. You yourself can imagine what a surprise a person has when I suddenly call him by name, and then list the diseases he suffered from, although a few minutes before his arrival, I did not know anything about him. Have you tried to ask the voice a question, who is he? Several times I asked him about it, but he never answered me. How do you treat? I am considered a herbalist and mainly treat with herbs. Do you know them well? Before, I knew absolutely nothing about them, but the voice taught me when to pick what kind of grass, how to harvest, etc. Well, how do you prepare medicines from them for this or that disease? Very simple. A voice tells me, for example, take such and such grass, steam them in a clay pot, drop a few drops of bat blood into the infusion, say such and such words, often this is a completely incomprehensible gibberish, and then pour the contents onto the ground. Spit in there and say this and that. Collect the damp earth in a jar, add olive oil and tell the patient to tie it to the sore spot until he recovers. There are, of course, other directions and recipes. I do everything that the voice tells me and, it's a wonderful thing, the person recovers. What began to embarrass you in your such successful practice? Very often I become aware that my former patients are literally haunted by unhappiness, and some of them go crazy. I do not know if this is the result of my treatment, but all this is very alarming to me. And besides, I became suspicious why the voice, which provided me with such a high social status and income, never answers the question of who he is. If this is God, then why does he not directly name himself? We had the opportunity to observe the young man over the next 4 years and noticed many good traits of his character, which were present in him initially, but due to improper upbringing, they hardly showed themselves or manifested themselves in a distorted form. His natural kindness and responsiveness allowed him to immediately feel the spirit of Christianity based on love. He sincerely believed in Christ and, realizing from whom he received paranormal abilities, completely abandoned healing, although it brought him a huge income. Having repented, he became a parishioner of the monastery that had opened at that time and regularly confessed to me, leading a very modest life. Analyzing the picture drawn by the psychic, using it as anamnestic data, as well as resorting to the help of our subsequent observations, we will try to draw some conclusions on their basis. 1. The contact between the creatures of the parallel world and the future psychic arose as a result of their visit in a visible image of a corrective labor colony. Materialization of SPM in the described case occurred in the region of the visible spectrum and had the form of numerous UFOs of a saucer shape. 2. The presumptive reason for the choice by these entities of our interlocutor as a future healer and, of course, an agent of influences, as we see it, two circumstances: A, the sinfulness, and therefore the gracelessness of the young man, common, however, for all inhabitants; B, the initially good qualities of his soul, which, as SPM guessed from experience, could subsequently lead him to the knowledge of God, which they in no way want to allow. Apparently, SPM was well aware that it would not be possible to raise a professional thief from this young man. There is no data for this, but a psychic from him, perhaps, could have turned out due to his inner disposition to help others. Possessing the psychic abilities of a healer is the best bait for a person with still good inclinations. In order to lead such people away from God, SPM often used the following recipe: the natural goodness laid down by the Creator in the soul of every person should be flavored with a good portion of vanity and abundantly anointed with money for a rich and well-fed life. With such a seasoning, as already noted, the perversion of all the good qualities of the soul will occur gradually, but inevitably, turning a person into an obedient instrument of SPM, into an agent of their influence in human society. 3. How did it happen? For an outside observer, everything here is a mystery and an inexplicable miracle. But, knowing the methods and capabilities of brothers in mind, from the parallel world, we can understand how exactly they processed their next victim. Having connected the young man to constant contact with the help of direct telepathic transmission of thoughts, psychiatrist, mentism, SPM instilled in him in advance, for example, information about incidents that they themselves simulated or were going to commit in the near future. Through the newly minted psychic, SPM also predicted events that even the authorities in the colony did not know about, although these events had already taken place somewhere. For example, in Moscow, a decree on early release was signed, but has not yet been dispatched. Thanks to close interaction with his Moscow colleague SPM, the curator of the camp psychic almost instantly received the necessary information from him, which was telepathically introduced into the psychic's consciousness. It was he who reported her to friends in misfortune. When the decree finally arrived at the camp a few days later, the prediction about it was perceived as a miracle. 4. From influence in the form of suggestion of thoughts, SPM soon passed to the suggestion of verbal information, which sounded in the mind of the newly minted prophet psychic in the form of a voice. This phenomenon was never considered natural, and therefore it was attributed by doctors to the field of pathological phenomena, and in psychiatry it was called verbal pseudo-hallucinosis. The voice broadcast by the creature of the parallel world gave the psychic correct, but previously unknown information, for example, about a patient who first came to his office for healing. 5. The methods of healing used in this case by the beings of the parallel world to maintain the authority of the psychic may have included some effect of medicinal herbs, but if there was, then, as it seems to us, its share in the effect of the patient's recovery was minimal. Our research has shown that SPM have incomparably more knowledge about the divine laws operating in the universe and about the structure of the material and spiritual world than any of the representatives of Homo sapiens. In addition, having the capabilities of influencing matter, and even human consciousness, that are completely incomparable with those that humans are capable of, SPM can correct some errors in the work of the human body without the help of drugs. They use medicines, as a rule, only to cover up their direct intervention in the work of the body, although most often this effect is in the nature of an imaginary healing. It consists in the fact that the patient's symptoms disappear for a while, but not the disease itself. Such an effect, in our opinion, allows SPM to suppress or neutralize pain impulses, received by the corresponding analyzers of the brain from the receptors of the diseased organ. Thanks to this, a person has a subjective feeling of improved well-being or even healing. The psychic, naturally, receives payment and gratitude for the healing, and meanwhile the disease, unnoticed by the patient, continues to secretly undermine the body. SPM, having completed their work on creating the image of a healer for a psychic, with a sense of accomplishment, interrupt the effect on the diseased organ, which can be compared in a sense with temporary anesthesia. Naturally, immediately after this, the symptoms of the disease return, and noticeably intensified, since the disease continued to covertly progress. However, occasionally healings are true, but our research shows that you still have to pay for them. As mentioned earlier, the very fact of turning to a psychic, sorcerer, folk healer, grandmother, alienates a person from divine grace, which allows SPM to come into direct contact with a person who has come for healing to a psychic contactee, who sometimes does not himself suspecting. Acts as an agent of influence of evil spirits in human society. In what form this contact will take place depends on which of the 3 SPM categories the person is assigned to. In the case of the girl's poetesses or the Dutch healer Yumanda, about her, below, we observe the use of pseudo-charismatic influence, but in the overwhelming majority of cases, the creatures of the parallel world use the tactics of hard pressure, which was observed after a Kashpirovsky's sessions or seminars conducted in Russia by Reiki masters from Germany. There is, however, an interesting detail to note. According to our data, the connection to universal life energy, Reiki, in non-orthodox countries, for example, in America or Europe, does not lead to such an open form of obsession as in Russia. On this score, we can make the following assumption. In a country that for centuries has preserved the undistorted teaching of Christ, orthodoxy, demons act with greater malice than in countries that have long ago fallen away from the right faith, back in the 11th century. This is on the one hand. On the other hand, the Lord probably allows this form of influence of demons as an educational measure that gives us the opportunity to think again and answer the most important question: who are we with? This may mean that the Creator is still waiting, that some of our compatriots can find their way to God and to salvation. By the way, this is what happened in the case of a failed Reikist, described below, with invisible worms crawling under his skin. A young Tatar Reikist, about him, further, through mistakes, delusions, and suffering came to know Christ. This insight and finding was the greatest result of a terrible experience, contact with an unknown, life energy. 6. All kinds of conspiracies were dictated to the psychic not at all because the spoken words have in themselves any power. This naive opinion should be discarded long ago. Conspiracies, as studies of this problem convince us, are just conventional signs, formulas for turning to SPM for help. Every conspiracy, even when it looks completely meaningless, is a conditional form of a specific request. This is a kind of code or password that is understandable to the person for whom it is intended. Apparently, the very fact of a person's personal address to them is important for the creatures of the parallel world, and the address is in verbal form. Only a free, personal appeal to SPM allows them to receive more and more power over the will and consciousness of the psychic. 7. The fears of the repentant psychic about the misfortunes that pursue in the future life of people who turn to him for help, as, indeed, to other psychics, healers, parapsychologists, magicians, sorcerers, etc., are confirmed by statistics. So, for example, Doctor of Psychological Sciences V. Lebedev, based on several thousand letters from viewers, summed up the television healing activities of the psychic Anatoly Kashpirovsky, famous in the early 90s. According to V. Lebedev, 63% of viewers who hoped for the help of a healer felt a sharp deterioration in their health. The other 14% of TV viewers who were expecting healing, after some improvement in their well-being, which they initially took for complete healing, fell ill again, but in a more severe form. About the remaining 22%, Dr. Lebedev could not say anything definite even in those years, because the consequences of extrasensory influence affected them later and not in such an obvious form as described above. A little later, many of these unfortunates suffered mental illness, and, having lost all hope of medical help, they came to the church for help. This creeping, life energy. Another example of what is the result of extrasensory influence can be cited from our own practice. One summer, from a distant Siberian city, a handsome young man of 28 to 30 years old, a Tatar by birth, came to our monastery. He said that in winter a group of psychics from Germany who practiced the Yuzui Reiki system came to their city. The Germans had an agreement with the esoteric club, which this young man attended, to conduct a series of seminars on the study of universal life energy, in Japanese, Reiki. The House of Culture was rented for guests from Germany. The seminars were, of course, paid and quite expensive. The Germans made great money on them. There were about 300 people, mostly members of the club and their acquaintances. The leaders of the seminar promised that as a result of the initiation, i.e. connecting to the universal life energy, Reiki, initiates will be able to become the owners of such extrasensory capabilities as manual diagnostics and healing. Healing of diseases will be accomplished by energy, Reiki, directed by the initiated student to the patient's diseased organ. Almost all those present wanted to become healers. For a special fee, passing through the rows and laying their hands on everyone's head, the Reiki masters connected the unfortunate to the energy, which, as we saw above, the Reikists themselves consider a person and even a god. So, after many such persons, or many gods, in Christianity it is customary to call them demons, entered the audience of the notorious seminar, incredible things began to happen to them. According to a young man who communicated with many of them, some began to hear voices, others fell into depression, and several people committed suicide. Others began to feel fear or constant extraneous psychological impact on consciousness, etc., and so on. The narrator himself was also in a very deplorable state. Incredibly painful tactile sensations began to haunt him. Worms gnawing at him seemed to crawl under the skin. This phenomenon is called synestopathy in psychopathology. With complete preservation of consciousness and absolutely adequate perception of reality, he quite correctly realized that in fact he could not have any worms under his skin. But his sensory perceiving, system said differently. The poor man was terribly tormented, wept with exhaustion, unable to endure the terrible torment that did not leave him day or night. Whatever he did, to what doctors only did I turn. But no one, not even the mullah, could help him. The torment was unbearable. On the advice of his wife, he was baptized into the Orthodox Church. It became somewhat easier for him. For a month, the victim of the Reikist psychics lived in our monastery, studying the Christian life, which, of course, he knew nothing about. Here he first began to confess and receive communion. Much was revealed to him in a different light, and he was able to evaluate many of his steps differently, from the point of view of the gospel teaching. Despair left without a trace, and he left with a reliable one that gradually, with the help of the grace of God, through the sacraments of the Holy Church, he would be able to free himself from the demon for whom he had so frivolously opened the gate to enter. To what has been said, we just add that synestopathy or tactile hallucinations, along with visual, sound, gustatory and olfactory hallucinations in the overwhelming majority of cases are just various forms of the sensory energy, influence of demons on the higher regulatory systems of the human brain. Why should a psychic be able to read? The study of many phenomena similar to those described above allows us to assert that when SPMs choose a person for pseudo-charismatic influence, trying to make him a conductor of their ideas or, as in the case of Reikists, their accomplice in introducing certain SPMs, demons, into human bodies. They use in practically the same ways, regardless of the era or country of residence, from social or intellectual status, from a person's age, and even more so from skin color. An excellent example of the universality of specific methods of their work with a person to prepare him for the role of an agent of influence, working under the guise of a white coat of a healer, is the following article in the newspaper, Soviet Russia. In it, the reader will be able to find much in common with what we told about the psychic healer at the beginning of this chapter. So, the psychic, whom S. Bulent Safe told about in his article, Uncle Zee's Hospital, lives on a completely different end of the earth. He has black skin, but he successfully heals with the same voice as our Russian, white psychic, although Uncle Zee has no education at all. The fact is, the correspondent admits, that he is simply illiterate and does not know the score. Yes, all this is not necessary for a black doctor from Central Africa. After all, it is not he who heals. For an hour, the reporter shook the bumpy roads from Guinea's capital, Bissau, to the hamlet where Uncle Zee had set up a hospital in the thatched roof huts. And finally, the journalist arrived at the scene. Uncle Zee, how did you become a healer? I used to work as a bricklayer in the city and one day I got very sick. I thought I was going to die. But God did not want this. He asked me, Jeff, Do you want to get well? Yes, I replied, I want to get well. Okay, God said, you won't die. But you won't be a bricklayer anymore. I will give you special strength, and you yourself will heal people. I agree. Yes, I answered God again, I agree. I came here, built a masu hut, and told people that I would treat them. Do you undertake to treat everyone, Uncle Z? First, I consult with God. I listen to the patient's complaints, and then pour water on the ground from this pot. The healer points to a large earthen vessel. And then God tells me if I can heal the person who came to me. What diseases do you treat? Diseases? Do not know. If a child has a stomach ache, I do it so that it doesn't hurt. If a person cannot walk, I treat his legs. How do you treat? God tells me which tincture should be given to the patient, which ointments should be rubbed in. Soviet Russia, no. 194 of August 22nd, 1987. Let us draw the reader's attention here to one very characteristic detail, which we will have to face more than once. It lies in the fact that very often the creatures of the parallel world come into direct, i.e. open, explicit, contact with the future psychic at the time of an accident, illness, accident, severe emotional shock or even clinical death, followed by resuscitation. As it was in the case of Marina Tsvigun, the founder of the White Brotherhood. Consideration of such accidents leads us to the idea that most of them, if not all of these accidents, are inspired by beings from a parallel world. If all the sorcerers disappeared. The fact that in some cases SPM can connect a person to contact with himself, regardless of his will and even unexpectedly for him, suggests that if suddenly one fine day sorcerers and psychics all over the earth would die out at once, and their books would be destroyed, then in a few years other new sorcerers with the same knowledge would appear. This would certainly happen because the SPM would certainly find among the remaining humanity those who are so significantly, due to their sinfulness, deprived of divine protection that it is possible to make contact with him at a one-sided desire, only on the part of the SPM, without caring about the will and the desires of the person himself. By connecting to the contact, these people would receive from SPM the same information that disappeared along with the previous sorcerers, magicians, occultists,